All right, good morning. Good morning, I'm Pete Daly, CEO, publisher of the Naval Institute. I welcome you all to Defense Forum Washington today. Our theme today is, are we building the Navy the nation needs? And first order of business today, I just ask you to please stand up and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. So, again, welcome to all our attendees, our Naval Institute members. We have several members of our board here today with us, our board of directors. I'd also like to acknowledge our conference sponsors, USAA. Lockheed Martin is here in force, represented by Brad Hicks, Mike Salvato, Robbie Harris, Glenn Sears, Cam Ingram, and Leonardo DRS, represented by Rear Admiral Larry Creevy, USN retired. Refreshments are available, as you saw, in the adjacent room. Our speakers will allow time today for questions and answers. The protocol, though, is please ask a question and then get the answer. And we've got mics, as you can see, positioned on each side of the room. We ask that you use those not only for the people in the room to hear, but for the people who are joining us in the projection of this elsewhere. This is an important juncture. Both the Commandant and the CNO have put some pretty strong markers down about the need to fight together in an integrated fashion. CNO has just issued his design that focuses on the Navy's future for warfighting, warfighters, and the future force structure. And yet there are many challenges in getting to the high-end warfight, and we've seen them play out in the news and the reports over the past few years. There's some challenges to fulfilling the national defense strategy, but we have the right people here in the room today to discuss those issues, and they will be able to twist the Rubik's Cube and examine them. So it's now my honor to introduce our first speaker, the Acting Secretary of the Navy, the Honorable Thomas Modly, 1983 grad of the Naval Academy, served in the Navy as a helicopter pilot, left active duty in 1990 to go to business school and serve in the private sector. After a distinguished career in the business world, he did a brief stint back at DoD as the Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Financial Management, and we're lucky to have Tom Modly serving as our 33rd Undersecretary and Acting Secretary of the Navy. We appreciate him giving us time today, and let's give a warm welcome to Secretary Modly.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. How's it going? Things change quickly in Washington, so I'm sure you're all aware of that. It's funny, Pete said that I had a brief stint in OSD. It was like the longest 5 years of my life. If anyone ever worked in OSD, they know what I'm talking about. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak with you. Thought I would talk to you a little bit today about what I'm trying to prioritize. No one really knows how long I'll be in this particular seat, but I'm not just in it to keep it warm. And so I have been, over the last couple years, as the under driving some pretty critical parts of what I think are important of an agenda for the future of the integrated naval forces. And I think this just gives me an opportunity to continue to push those things, and I'm going to do that. So I thought I'd talk you through, if you don't mind, just a little bit of the things that have been on my mind over the last couple years. Some of you I know have seen me speak before over the last couple years as the under. Now that I'm the acting, you'll probably pay more attention than you did before. But I do want to talk about just things that are on my mind and how those things have helped to drive the things that I would like to push for the however long I have as the acting Secretary of the Navy. So I use a little bit of a process that I used to use when I was teaching at the Air Force Academy, and I taught at the Air Force Academy for about 3 years, last 3 years of active duty. And what I noticed about my students was that they're very overwhelmed with information. And so I was finding that a lot of these kids would come to class and many of them didn't do the reading assignment for the day. And so I'd start lecturing and I'd realize that, they're not really getting into the deeper level discussion that I really wanted to get them to get into because of that lack of preparedness. And I don't blame them. I was a midshipman at one time, and I understand all the various demands that you have, and one of the things that you learn to do there is how to prioritize your time and think about things, what's the most important thing to focus on. And I think most people at the Naval Academy, unless they're, math geniuses like Mike Petters and other people, they spend most of their time on, the engineering classes, EE, because those are the things that can kill you. And I think that's not a bad way to go about thinking about what to prioritize when you're in active duty either. But I didn't want to. I was teaching political science, American government and politics, as well as international relations, national security, and so my sense was that it'd be much more fruitful if I could get these kids involved early on in the class. So what I did is at the beginning of the semester, I would take my entire each section and I would divide it up into groups of four students, and they would be assigned to a group, and they would get that group for the entire semester, and they would basically be assigned that group, and each person in that group would have a number, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and that number was their number permanently assigned for that group. And in the first 5 minutes of the class, I would give them time to get together and cluster together as a group of 4 in their cluster and talk about the reading assignment from the night before. And I was very cognizant that some of the kids didn't do it, but they had a 5-minute opportunity to go through the reading assignment and write down the 10 or so, 5 to 10 most important things that they felt either capsulized into 1 or 2 words that they felt were the most important things that were discussed in the reading assignment from the night before. And I have them put them on a little note card, and then I would collect them. But I'd kind of walk around and see who was engaged and who wasn't engaged. And I would collect all the note cards, and I'd stick them in my pocket, and then I would lecture. And then at the end of the 30-minute or so lecture, every single day I had a quiz for the section. And in addition to being a Navy guy at the Air Force Academy, this may be one of the least popular professors at the Naval Academy. At the Air Force Academy. But what I did was the quiz was taken by one person for each group. And the way I decided who would take the quiz for that group is I would roll the dice. So if the 1s came up, all the 1s took the quiz for their group. If the 2s came up, et cetera, et cetera. If 5 came up, they could choose the person that could take the quiz for the group. So that first 5 minutes, they could kind of figure out who was clueless and who wasn't, and they picked the right person to take the quiz for them. If 6 came up, I got to choose. So as I'm walking around, I know who the clueless ones were, and that's the person that would take the quiz. Well, pretty soon they caught on, and no one was clueless anymore because they all wanted to get the best possible grade they could get on the quiz. So at the end of the semester, I collected all these key terms together, and I synthesized them all. I had 5 sections of students. I synthesized them all and put them on a piece of paper. I think I used something called a mimeograph machine to put it all on, to get it printed out. It took about 5 days to get it to the mimeograph people to have it printed out, so it had to be perfect or else you couldn't redo it. And I handed those out to them a week before the final exam. I said, this is your final exam. I said, all my questions are going to come from this list. And this is not a list that I added anything to. This is the list that you all felt were the most important things to have learned in this class. And I can't argue with any of it. So that's how they did the quiz. So it's been kind of a device that I've used just as I've gone on in terms of thinking about how you stay focused on things that are important. What are the things that are on your mind? So having been in the under job for a couple years, I've sort of refined this list over time. And it sort of started out as like a big disorganized word cloud with no prioritization. So today, the first time I'm sort of out talking as the acting secretary, I've prioritized it. And I'm going to go down the list in terms of what I think are the most important things on my mind right now. And then drive into a discussion a little bit about what I'm prioritizing in terms of what I would like to get accomplished in this, however long I have in this job. Okay? China. This is probably number one. When I started this thinking 2 years ago, I was talking about Chinese mercantilism, because that was sort of the context I was coming from the private sector. I've sort of shifted it just to China in general. As a theme, as a symbol, as a challenge, it's our biggest challenge as a nation, I think, going into as this century unfolds. They've changed substantially. Their presence in the South China Sea, their aggressiveness in the South China Sea is very apparent to everyone. It's interesting, too, to think about what we thought about them when I was still in the Navy. I was thinking about our 30-year shipbuilding plan and how we have this plan to get to 355 ships by the year 2052, which is a long way off, as we all know. And so I thought, I'm going to go back and look at things that were written 30 years ago, 30 plus years ago, about the Pacific. And what were we thinking about back then in the Pacific? And I found this article in the Naval War College Review that was published in 1985. And it talked about the Japanese 1,000-mile sea lane defense responsibility. And this article, it was extremely well written about what we had to do to get the Japanese to take on that responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. Not one mention in the article about China, not one. Everything was about Russia. And when Ensign Moodley wrote that article, which was brilliantly written, he wasn't thinking about China, and nor were a lot of other people. But if you take a look at what their forces looked like then, particularly when I got out of the Navy in 1990, what they had in theater compared to our forward deployed naval forces, we're pretty much static. We're about the same as we were, and theirs are substantially advanced, in addition to some of the aggressive things that they're doing with some of their neighbors with respect to some of these artificial islands and other disputed territories. And it's a big challenge for us. And when you look at any scenario that you look at in terms of what conflict would look like with China, it doesn't look good for either one of us. So last night, some of us were at a speech with Henry Kissinger, and he was talking about this, and that we have a huge military challenge with China, but we also have a huge diplomatic challenge with China. And we have to step up and basically and approach it with much more of a whole of government approach to try and resolve this problem. But for the Navy particularly, we need to think hard about what that means for future naval forces. Next one. Our old friends, enemies, friends, and now enemies again, I guess. I don't know. We don't have a good strategy for Russia either. And they are becoming very adept at operating in gray zones in areas beneath the sort of standard understanding of what conflict would be. They're also investing heavily in their submarine forces. They're also getting a lot more aggressive in terms of their presence in the Middle East. We're seeing this, obviously we're seeing this in Syria and other places. And they present a whole other series of challenges for us that we need to start taking seriously, and it has profound implications for the Navy. This is the other thing that we need to keep in mind. The world's economy has grown substantially over the last 30 years. Trade over the sea and our trade over the sea has tripled in the last 20 or so years. This is the heart of our GDP, and we have to ensure that we have a Navy that can protect it. But our Navy right now is half the size that it was at the end of the Cold War. So we have to think about what that means for us and how we protect the key economic trade routes that we have. This is another good statistic. I'm sort of flashing back to when I got out of the Navy stories, but in 1990, when I got out of the Navy, there was one fiber optic cable, transatlantic fiber optic cable. Now there are 600 of them. The capacity of these cables used to be 1 terabyte per second. Now it's about 130 terabytes a second. The amount of information, the amount of transactions that travel across these cables, particularly the world's financial markets, is pretty staggering when you see it. And most of these cables are unprotected. They're long, it's hard to protect them. And they travel under the sea, and that's a responsibility of the Navy to protect. So how do we think about that challenge? Another big one for us. Cyber espionage. Again, I think like when Mike and I were at the academy, we took a computer course at a place called Luce Hall It was like loud when you walked in there because they had these teletype machine sounding computers. That's what it was like. And the advancements, obviously, and this is no great revelation, but the advances in technology and the information age have really accelerated our ability to progress as humanity, but they've created massive vulnerabilities for us. And we're seeing that in every single plane. And those two adversaries that I just mentioned, and I know I've been cautioned not to call them adversaries because it means something to the Chinese that we're not supposed to say. Competitors then are coming after us in ways in the cyberspace that is illegal. They've stolen substantial amounts of intellectual property from us, and we haven't been able to keep up with how we deter that type of activity, and we have to. Okay, this used to be my number one, not enough ships, but I sort of moved it around. All these things sort of lead to this point. As I mentioned, at the end of when we hit the 597 or so ship Navy, so at the end of the Cold War, we're at 290 now. When I got to the Pentagon 2 years ago, we were at 275. The trajectory to 355, and 355 is stated as national policy in the Defense Authorization Bill, and it's also the President's goal during the election. We have a goal of 355. We don't have a plan for 355. And we need to get a plan for, if it's not 355, what's it going to be, what's it going to look like. Everything was based around the 2016 Force Structure Assessment, which said that we needed basically 12 carriers, 104 large surface combatants, 52 smalls, sort of everything derivative from that. I'm not sure that's the right force mix anymore. And we need to look at that, and that's what we're doing, and that's part of what the Commandant and the CNO are looking at. How do we look at an integrated force mix? What does that mean? How different is it? How does unmanned play into this? What do unmanned systems do for that? Are they accelerators? Are they inhibitors? We've got to do a lot of thinking about this, and we've got to do a lot of war gaming on it to make sure that whatever trajectory we're on, when we get there, we're where we should be. And to me, at the end game, the number doesn't matter as much as how agile those forces are that we end up with. Because what we can say about the future is that it's going to be very unpredictable. That's the one predictable thing we can say. So to the extent that we have forces that are agile, and this is a classic example of what's happened in the private sector over the last 20 years. The companies that were agile, that were looking at the future and changing and understanding that they needed to change every couple of years to keep up with the rapid pace of technological innovation, are the ones that survived. Does everyone know that Kodak had the patent for digital photography, and they did not pursue it because they didn't want to cannibalize their existing film business? And where are they now? There are so many examples of this where people get blinded by tradition and what works, what seems to work, and they don't look beyond that. And we're not great at that. If you read the stories in the 1920s and 30s about how resistant the battleship captains were to the advent of aviation and the use of aviation in the Navy, it took battleship guys to actually drive it, who became evangelists for it. And I think we are looking for that as well in the Navy. This is a big issue, and our carriers are very, very expensive pieces of machinery. They're amazing. There's no question. I was on the Ford last week. The Ford is something the president is very concerned about, talks about it a lot, talks to us about it a lot. I think his concerns are justified because the ship is very, very expensive and it needs to work. And there are all the trail of tears as to why we are where we are, but right now we need to fix that ship and make sure that it works. And I'm certain, I know that our industry partners are committed to that. I know that Fleet Forces are, the CNO. We just have to get after it because there's nothing worse than having a ship like that, our most expensive asset, being out there as a metaphor and a whipping boy for why the Navy can't do anything right. And so we're going to get it right, and that's going to be one of my top priorities here. This hurts us from getting certain things right. Our acquisition processes are very antiquated. They're not fast. They're not agile. We are making some progress. There's this constant fight and flow between OSD oversight and the service oversight that slows things down. We're in another battle for that right now. Congress made a decision a couple years ago to sort of drive down a lot of acquisition responsibility to the services, and right now OSD is trying to pull it back again. So we have to make a decision which way we go. Part of the problem with the Ford is how do you determine who's accountable for decisions that were made 10, 12 years ago, where the service had responsibility, OSD had responsibility, no one who was there who made those decisions is still around because it's such a long program. So we have to think about how we do things a little bit more rapidly. And in these programs that, particularly these large, lengthy programs, it's very, very difficult to do that. But it's a reality that we face because these ships are very, very complicated and we need them. But we have to improve how we get them out. Everything that the Ford should be able to do is going to be a game changer for us. We just have to make sure that it can do it because we've got several more coming behind it. So, enough on the Ford. Legacy business operations. These are the things that a lot of people don't normally think about. The back office systems, our financial management systems, our ability to audit our finances. We went through our first full financial audit last year. First time in the history of the United States Navy we did that, and we took it extremely seriously. I chaired the audit committee because I understood that it's an enterprise problem, it's not a financial management problem. Some of the things we found out and through the audit really help us understand the challenges that we have. More than half of our findings, notices or NFRs that we have on this, are related to IT. Lack of proper IT control, lack of systems that are modern. But some of them are just blocking and tackling. And I'll give you an example. We found a warehouse down in I think it was in Jacksonville, with over $150 million worth of parts in it, okay, for aircraft parts. We didn't know we had the parts. We didn't even know we had the warehouse. None of the parts were in the inventory system. When they discovered this and they entered all the parts into the inventory system, within a couple weeks, over $20 million of requisitions for parts from that warehouse for aircraft that were down for parts that we didn't know we had. This is why the audit's so important. We also had challenges with our industrial base not keeping track for themselves on parts that they were holding for us in inventory. These are basic blocking and tackling, financial management, inventory control, IT controls that are second nature in private sector. And we just have to get better at this. And so we're going to keep after these problems. Also looking at the supply chain, our logistics and supply chain, and the challenges that we have there. Not a single point of accountability on logistics and supply chain in the Navy. If you ask the question, who owns that problem? Why are these IT systems not talking to one another? Who developed that one? It's a lot of this. Well, they own that, and they own that, and they make a decision on that. It's just not suitable for a future where we need to be able to pivot quickly and understand what we have quickly. And in an environment where the budget's going to get tighter and the taxpayers and their representatives in Congress want us to be more accountable for the dollars. Industrial base. We have significant challenges in the industrial base. We don't have enough suppliers. We've reduced the number of prime contractors by a substantial number over the last 10 years or so. We have not given good demand signals to the industrial base to know what to invest in. We have to do a much better job of that. But there's just some basic things that are happening out there that are very disturbing. We have only one large barrel gun manufacturer left in the United States. We only have one supplier who can do propeller shafts, manufacturing and repair, one that's left. There's only one manufacturer who produces the critical element for our rocket fuel, for solid rocket motors, one. These are challenges that we have to get after. It's going to be very, very difficult for us. As we start looking at hypersonics and investing in hypersonics, the biggest challenge we have in hypersonics, in my opinion, is not the technical ability. We've got the science pretty much figured out. We've got it so figured out that the Chinese already stole it from us, and they're way ahead of us. Okay, we need to get an industrial capacity to produce at scale, and we don't have it right now. And part of it's because we haven't given a good signal to industry. Part of it's because there hasn't been a national will to do this. But we have to do something. We have to do things like that in a lot of different areas. I know that the big primes have this same problem. Their supplier bases, they don't have the ability to compete within their supplier bases. And so that's a huge challenge for them as well. So this is a national problem. It's not just a government versus industry problem. It's a national problem. Strain on our forces. We've been at war now for almost 20 years. And you're starting to see what that's doing to our forces. I'm not going to go into great detail about some of the cultural challenges that we're having in the special operations. I think some of that's been fairly well documented in the media. But we do have it, and we acknowledge it. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we've been asking people to do extremely hard, stressful, and dangerous jobs for 20 years. And I'll tell you just a quick story. I met a Marine who was doing some special operations work, the type of work that in my seat as the under, my former seat as the under, it's a smaller seat, that I have to sign out. And he was injured in Afghanistan last January. He took some shrapnel, and I had heard he was injured, and so I went to his commander and said, hey, you can send him, if he wants to come home, he can come home. And he said, no, sir, I want to stay. I want to stay on the mission. 2 weeks later, he lost both of his legs in an IED explosion. One above the knee, the other below the knee. And so when I went to Bethesda to meet with him and talk to him, and I said, hey, what are you going to do now? He said, well, sir, I'm going to get fitted with prostheses and learn how to walk, and I want to go back over to Afghanistan. And I said, why? He said, because I don't know how to do anything else. I think he's probably 37, 38 years old. He started this journey 20 years ago. That's all he knows. So it's causing significant strain on our forces that we have to really think hard about how long we want to keep these folks out, particularly in these extremely high stress, high violent, close contact type of work, because it does have the capability, it does have the potential to create a cultural problem within the Special Operations Force, and we saw some of this play itself out. I know that Admiral Green is really working really hard to get after this, and I fully support him on that. The corollary to that is the strain on military families, and we see that in a lot of different ways. I was testifying at the SASC this week on the public-private partnership for housing, which is something that's sort of blown up in the last year or so. We have created these private partnerships 20 years or so ago. We never could have recapitalized all these homes had we not done this. It was like about a $13 billion investment that the private sector put in. And what happened over the course of time is that the military command sort of abdicated its responsibility, in my opinion, for oversight. And didn't make that part of what the commander's responsibility was, to check on their people and to really raise hell if things weren't working out. We're getting after this problem as well. But you can imagine being at war for 20 years, having a young family, young growing family, and you're in a house that's got mold problems and you can't get anyone to address it for you. We've seen repeated examples of this. And those are the exacerbated situations. In the situations, even when the home is fine, you still have families that have been separated for a long time and under a lot of stress. And it just takes, it's a lot that we ask of these folks. And it's a concern. Suicide rate also is something that's a high concern. Every month I sign out in my new job, I sign out condolence letters. And I signed out my first package of this the other day, and I would say half of them were suicide. And so this is a challenge for us as a society as well. I look at the statistics. We're not, for our demographics, we're not above the national averages, but that doesn't mean it's not a bad problem for us. And so we're working on ways to sort of increase sort of personal contact and encourage people to increase that personal contact, because that seems to be the one thing that really can intervene and make a difference. Okay, Iran. I put Iran in quotation marks because Iran is it's more of a metaphor than just a specific situation. When I talk about all these things and I talk about unpredictability, this is what I'm talking about. Things will happen. Things will pop up that we don't expect. Iran has started to get aggressive. Our response is we send a carrier over there. Now that carrier is over there for 10 and a half months, steaming, right? That has ancillary effects through the entire readiness of the entire naval force. We're focusing on Russia and China, great power competition, but other things happen that we can't control. And a lot of it's stuff not being driven by great powers. What all this sort of comes together to me as a conclusion is that we've had a gradual loss of our competitive advantage from the time that I got out of the military, not because I got out of the military, but since I got out of the military to now. I don't think that's unnatural, but we have to think about how we manage this, and most specifically how we as a Navy adjust to this. How do we adjust to all these different factors? So what is to be done? It's a famous quote from Vladimir Lenin, but I'm not a big fan of his, but I do like this quote because the question is, what do we do about this? We have a myriad of different problems. How do we address them? And the answer is, okay, I believe a focus on agility and agile naval forces. And what does that mean? I think it embodies several characteristics, things that we need to be thinking about when we look at our future force mix, we look at how we look at our people, et cetera. These are characteristics that I've sort of thought about for some time. I started thinking about this back in private sector when I was trying to understand why certain companies succeed and why they don't. And I think these are just organizational and human factors that create the environment that allows certain organizations to thrive and others not. First one's velocity. Got to do things faster. We absolutely have to do things faster. I joke a lot that as the undersecretary, it took me over 6 weeks to get English muffins in the Secretary of the Navy mess. And the only way he did it is because Steve Deal was sitting back there, actually was so frustrated he went to the grocery store and bought a package of them and stuck them in the refrigerator in the SecNav's mess. And that's the kind of innovative thinking we need, but we got to do things faster. It's just a symbol, it's a metaphor for how slow it is to do things, how slow we've made things for ourselves. And it's not sustainable. We've got to be able to do things faster. Collaboration, we need to have a much more collaborative culture. We need to have a much more collaborative relationship with our allies, the ones we have now, and partners who we're trying to turn into allies over time. And that requires certain skills. That requires breaking down stovepipes, breaking down barriers. I used to call the Department of Defense the great self-siloing organization, because all you had to do was set up an office and all of a sudden they'd have their own lanyards, they'd have their own coffee mugs, and they were their own thing. And when I was there the first time around, I was given responsibility for a program called the BMMP program. Does anyone remember that? Business Management Modernization Program? You do? Okay. Are you okay? A lot of us had to go to detox after that one, but they had their own stuff, their own lanyards, their own, we're BMMP, we're the BMMP program. They had coffee mugs, they had lanyards, they had these things called, they had these squishy balls, these things, purple squishy balls, like they would hand them out at conferences. If I ever write a book about my experience at OSD, I think I'm going to call it Purple Squishy Balls, because I said, why do you guys have these purple squishy balls? And they said, well, sir, we're joint, I said, okay, no more purple squishy balls. We're not going to have any purple squishy balls. So we evolved the BMMP to the Business Transformation Agency, and we got this great new space over there in Crystal City. We tore down all the walls. It was going to be a big open. I said, I want this to be like, a high-tech place, like kind of like Amazon or Google. Well, now it is Amazon. So, But it was really cool. So they're taking me on the tour of the space, and it was really neat. And they get to this this door, and the door's closed. And I said, well, what's in there? They're like, sir, you don't want to go in there. I was like, why not? Just please, just keep walking. I said, no, open the door. Boxes and boxes and boxes of blue squishy balls. And I said, what is up with the blue squishy balls? I said, well, sir, you said no purple squishy balls. So we got blue ones instead. So anyway, I don't think they got the point. But the point is that we can be very, very siloed. We can be very, very non-collaborative, and we have to break those barriers down. I'm going to go back. So visibility. This is all about transparency. We're slaves to a very bad data environment in DoD, and particularly in the Navy, and we've got to fix that, and we're getting after that. Adaptability, clearly everyone knows what that means. You have to be able to adapt to different conditions. I love the story of Dory Miller. Do you guys know who Dory Miller is? I love the story of Dory Miller. Dory Miller was a seaman, I think a seaman apprentice at Pearl Harbor. Was that right, Steve? Seaman apprentice. In Pearl Harbor. He was an African-American sailor. At that particular time in the history of the Navy, he was not allowed to man a gun because we didn't allow African-Americans to man a gun. Pearl Harbor happens. He gets up on the deck and mans because everyone else is dead. He gets and mans a machine gun and starts shooting down Japanese aircraft as they come in. And for that, he won the Navy Cross. But it's emblematic of, you don't know who's going to have to step up when. And so we need to have people and forces that are adaptable and can change quickly because the environment, as I mentioned before, is changing so quickly. Innovation, we need to be far more innovative. I think we're doing good things in this area, but we've got to pick up the pace on this and also be willing to accept failure. If you've ever read the Wright brothers biography, it's a great story. It's a great innovation story. It was over 100 years ago. 115, 116 years ago, these two guys just sort of in a bicycle shop said, we've got a vision, and the vision is we're going to fly, we're going to harness air to be able to take a heavier than air thing to the air, and they just experimented and experimented and experimented and documented and documented and documented, and that's innovation. It's not capricious. It's not like, hey, let's try this crazy thing. We have to become far more innovative. Humility. We have to be willing to accept what our weaknesses are and understand them and go after them. Trust. We have to build trust in an organization. And then skepticism. I know this last one sometimes gets people upset because they think it's a negative attribute. I don't think it's a negative attribute at all. I think it's a very positive attribute. You have to be skeptical. You have to be able to push back, even on your own ideas, to ensure that the right outcome is what you get at the end of the day. And that's what Agile Navy, so we need forces. We need forces that embody these characteristics, and we need people that embody these characteristics. Okay, so to the punchline here. My top 3 priorities right now for however long I'm going to be in this job. So it could be for a day or two, or it could be, who knows how long. Number 1, gray hulls. We have to figure out this force structure. We have to make sure that we're investing in the right things because the investment in these things takes a long time to come to fruition. And so we need to think about that. We need to think about what 355 means. If 355 is not the number, we ought to know what the right number is. And we ought to be lobbying for that and making a case for it and arguing in the halls of the Pentagon for a bigger share of the budget if that's what's required. But we have to come to a very clear determination of what that means, and also all the equipment that we need to support that. How much more hypersonics capability do we need? Where are we going to put it? These are long-term investments that we would have to make, but we have to get our story straight first. So I'm going to focus a lot on that issue, and also the readiness of the ships we have right now. We have to make sure that the ships we have right now are ready as well, and they're also tired. But we have to get after that. I know it sounds like a paradox that we can't solve, but we have to figure out a way to solve it because we just don't know. We could be planning for some potential conflict with China that we think might happen in 2035. But what happens if it happens tomorrow? Or something else happens tomorrow? If an Iran, in quotation marks, or name your country or terrorist group happens tomorrow. Are we ready for that? And we need to get after that. Second one, gray matter. This is, I think, going to be forever our enduring competitive advantage that we have. When I talked about erosion of competitive advantage, I talked about it in a lot of ways with the sense to what we see in material and mass and GDP and all those things. We have to make sure that we don't lose our competitive advantage in our minds and the minds of the people that we ask to do these very, very hard jobs. And so we're going to be investing heavily in this. Many of you have seen the Education for Sea Power report that we put out last year. We are full steam ahead on that. It's been a priority of mine since I walked in the door. I think we've made tremendous progress. A lot of support from people in this room I know have provided input into this. It's sort of an unassailable, it's an unassailable goal for us. And so we're going after that in full force. And then the last one is gray zones. Gray zones are all those things that you don't normally think about. And I'll give you a little more. So when I talk about gray hulls, force design, 355 plus, understand what that means. Ensure the integration between the Navy and Marine Corps plans for forces. Look at how we become a lot more distributive network in order to complicate our adversaries or our competitors' way they think about us. And the sustainability factor. We can't put a bunch of ships out, just put a bunch of ships out there and not have a plan for how we're going to sustain them. Again, gray matter, the Education for Sea Power initiative, really driving towards the intellectual and ethical excellence of our people. I think we've had some broaches in that. We've seen a little bit of it in the special warfare community. There's a lot of other areas where we need to address this. Over the past several years, we've had challenges. The Fat Leonard scandal, for example. We really have to drive the intellectual and ethical excellence of our people. And that's not just the uniformed people, it's the civilians as well. We're driving a new human capital strategy as well to be able to come up with new ways to attract people into the government, into the military from non-traditional ways, offering opportunities for them to serve, go back to industry, come back and serve again. This is a normal flow. When I was at PwC, we were very clear that we would bring in people straight out of college, and although we'd like them to stay until they became partners, we knew that was never going to happen. A lot of them, and a lot of our best people would leave after 2 or 3 years and go out to industry. And some of them would come back, and they'd be better when they came back. And some of them would stay, and they'd become our clients. We have to think about our human capital as more of a network. We need to think about our people and our national security as more of a network, where we have people who can work in industry, understand industry's perspective, come back into the government, and be able to share those ideas, and it's critical for us to be able to advance. And then a whole-of-nation approach. We need much more of a whole-of-nation approach to R&D. We have to be able to sync ourselves with the massive advances, particularly in the technological and the AI space, that the private sector is making. And we have to be able to sync that together. And then the last one, of course, the gray zones. And the gray zones are basically that whole business mission. I talked to you about the audit. The audit sounds like a very mundane and boring, and but it is so critical. The things we're finding are so critical to creating forces that can do all the things I just talked about. So this is an area that I'm focusing on heavily. Information management. Many of you are aware we just created a new senior special advisor and CIO. He's got a highly empowered organization with 4 directorates underneath him, a chief technology officer, a chief digital strategy officer, a chief data officer, and a chief information security officer. And this CIO, I was able to recruit from the private sector. He wants to come in and serve. He's fantastic. His team is half private, half public sector people. And we're going to be issuing our information management strategy here at the end of this year. Partners and allies, again, we cannot do this defense and security mission, particularly the Maritime One, alone. We have to enlist the participation and friendship and collaboration with our partners and allies. Every quarter or so, I meet with all the folks that are going off to be defense attachés. Are any of those guys here today that I met with the other day? Okay, good. they're going all over the world. And I told them, you know, those military-to-military relationships are critical to the country. So don't ever take it for granted that you may be the first American that some of these people you're working with have ever worked with in their lives. Because some of these countries, I didn't even know we sent naval attachés to. Same goes with their families. These are the only Americans some of these kids in these countries are ever going to meet. And it's a really, really important mission. And it pays huge dividends at the end. Space, again, we are very, very dependent on space. So I'm excited about the direction we're headed with the Space Force, collaboration with the Air Force on that. We have major vulnerabilities in space, but we also have major capabilities in space that we have to be able to sustain. And then, of course, the counter-ISR mission. Again, these are all things that sort of happen in non-traditional ways to think about what we need to be focusing on. Last thing I want to think about and try to think about and try to get the Naval Service to think about is asymmetry. If we try to be completely defensive, we're going to spend ourselves into oblivion trying to meet all these challenges. We have to think about how we leverage our creativity as a country, our goodness as a country, to get a larger network of friends and partners who are with us in these challenges. And also to make it more complicated and make it more unpredictable for our competitors to know what we're doing and how we're going about doing it. Okay. Tell you one quick story. Senior Chief Cryptological Technician Shannon Kent. I learned about her at her funeral about a year ago. And everything I heard people come up and talk about her embodied all those characteristics I talked to you about agility. She was a collaborator, she was a coach, she was innovative, she did things quickly, she was constantly on the go. People trusted her. She had skepticism. She voiced her concerns when she had issues. All those characteristics. And we lost her. So at the end of the day, everything that we're doing and everything that I'm focusing on, whatever catchphrase I put around it, gray zones, gray matter, gray holes, it's all about that. The person that's at the end, the person's at the end of that chain, who we put out in harm's way to keep us safe. And so that's my focus. That's what I'll be doing as I'm sitting in this seat for the next several months. And if you ever hear that I'm swaying from that, then come tell me. Because I can be my best skeptic too, but sometimes I'm blinded by what I think is right. So thank you very much for your time.
Secretary Modly, thank you for your time and your insights today. In keeping with your number one concern being China, we have a Naval Institute press book to thank you. It is called Chinese Communist Espionage, an Intelligence Primer by Peter Mattis and Matthew Brazil, a Naval Institute press book. Thanks again for your time, and we look forward to however long you have in your new job.
Okay. So for our next event in the program is to have Secretary Bob Work talk with C&O. And it's my honor to introduce the Secretary. He was the 32nd Deputy Secretary of Defense, working under 3 different secretaries across 2 different administrations. Previously, he served as the Chief Executive Officer for the Center for New American Security, and from 2009 to 2013, served as the Undersecretary of the Navy. Mr. Work is currently back at the Center for New American Security as a Distinguished Senior Fellow for Defense and National Security. He's also a Senior Counselor at Telemus Group, LLC, a Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, and a Distinguished Visiting Fellow at MITRE. He served 27 years on active duty as a Marine officer in a wide range of positions, including command of an artillery battery and battalion. He's been a member of the Naval Institute since 1974, and he's currently the chair of the board of the Naval Institute. Let's give a warm welcome to Secretary Bob Work as he leads a conversation with our Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Mike Gilda.
Told me to come on up.
I know, he was slow.
Thank you, sir. Sir.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with the CNO. We had hoped to have the Commandant here also, but he was unable to be here today. So we have the great good fortune to gang up on the CNO over the next hour. Admiral Gilda has a remarkable career. He served on the Chandler, which for those of you, that was the last of the kid class, the Itoa class, the sprue can that we all wanted. Served on 2 Tychos, the Princeton and the Gettysburg. Commanded the Higgins and the Binfold, both of them Burkes. Commanded Destroyer Squadron 7, the Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group, and was the commander of Carrier Strike Group 8 with the USS Eisenhower. He also has some other things on his resume, which I'll bring out during the morning. But I think we're blessed to be able to have someone like Admiral Gilda to be our CNO. And so I'd like to jump right in, CNO. You know, I remember in January of 2009, I got a phone call that said, hey, do you want to be the Undersecretary of the Navy? And I thought I was getting punked. I was on the Obama transition team, but I had no expectation of going in. And I imagine when you got the call almost a little bit ago, that it might have been very much the same. So not having that chance of having a normal transition period, what's your first 100 days been like?
Thanks for that question. I think it's a good warm-up to kind of give you a sense of how I came into the job and where my thoughts have been over the past few months. But before I say that, I'd just like to take a moment just to express my condolences. We lost 2 civilian shipmates at Pearl Harbor last night and 1 sailor. And it was a shooting. The sailor took his own life, and he fired upon 3 civilian shipyard workers, and 2 of them died. One of them is still in serious condition with a hip injury. And so those families, those sailors that served with him are in our thoughts and prayers. So in terms of my 100 days, it was very quick. It's one of those, everybody's had a moment like this in their life when things change within a 48-hour period. And so the run-up to the confirmation hearing, which was really phase 1 and everybody's worst final exam, was very quick. And then I really didn't have a transition or much of it before I walked into the job. I did not establish a transition team. And the primary reason for that is because I knew I was going to be traveling a lot. But more importantly, I felt that I really needed to understand things for myself. And so in terms of context, I was coming in from almost a decade of joint service. I did have Carrier Strike Group Command. I did have command of Fleet Cyber Command, Navy's 10th Fleet. That Fleet Command job wasn't necessarily a deep Navy blue job. There was a lot of jointness to that. And so I really had to learn for myself. So I did travel. I met with the fleet. I didn't have a lot of preconceptions on where I wanted to go with guidance. And then when right after I was confirmed, I met with the 4 stars. And what I did is on a placemat, I laid out what I believe to be Admiral Richardson's trilogy of guidance. I laid out his secret strategy, and then his design 2.0, and then his budget guidance. And I spoke to the 4 stars about that. I could see the clear direction across those documents in terms of great power competition, China being the pacing peer competitor, and where we wanted to go. And I felt, having watched the Navy and was very proud of the Navy's direction over the past couple of years, actually before the National Defense Strategy ever came out, Admiral Richardson had us cited in this direction, and I thought that the Navy had it right in terms of strategic direction, and I didn't question that. I did think, in the feedback that I received, led me to simplify and prioritize, and I actually liked Design 2.0 that Admiral Richardson had issued about a year ago, and so I didn't want to discard it, and so I decided to call it a Frago. To modify it. And so most of you know what a fragmentary order is. And so that was my thinking. I also met with the 4 stars again, along with the 3-star fleet commanders, the day after I took over as CNO, and received some more feedback. And then I wrote the draft myself, and I had a gathering with all the 3 and 4 stars in the Navy. I brought in the senior, enlisted the master chiefs from their commands. We talked about it, and then I gave them 2 weeks to give me written feedback, which actually helped me sharpen my focus and expose me to a few blind spots that I knew I had, but I didn't know where they were. So since I've been in the job, I've done some traveling. I've learned that I have much less discretionary time than I ever thought I would. So I'm trying to use my time very wisely. Where I find myself investing most time right now is on programs and on budget. And so we're at the end game with the 21 budget, and we're wrestling with the ongoing CR in 20. And so we have some challenges with respect to prioritization in terms of moving forward. So that's kind of in a nutshell. I would also say that my role as a Joint Chief is one that I take extremely seriously. So I do spend a lot of time studying and thinking about North Korea, Iran, China, the real hotspots that when you do walk into a tank with the chiefs and you do get that opportunity to provide your best advice, that advice matters, because you may only get one shot, and the stakes are pretty high.
Well, I'd like to dig in a little bit on
Sure.
the Frago. You mentioned it just was published yesterday, and I'll ask you some more pointed questions as we go along this morning. But do you want to give any kind of an OV1 view of your Frago?
Strategic view, great power competition. Some of you may have taken a look at the Frago. There are 3 sections to it: war fighting, war fighters, and then future Navy. I was really looking for a third W. It's WWF right now. I couldn't find that third W, so it's just future fleet. If you think of something really cool, let me know, because you never know when Frago 2 will come out. But that's essentially how I structured it. And then there are a number of priorities that we can kind of speak to. But one of the conclusions you'll draw as you read it is you'll see that I'm really focused on the near to midterm. I tend not to think about China in a 2035 mindset. I tend to think about China in a much closer period of time in terms of potential trouble. That's not to say that I believe that a conflict with China is unavoidable. I do think that mindset and attitude are everything. And whether you're playing football or whether you're a fireman in the engine room in a ship, it matters how you think, and that you think about, and that we take our peer competitors very, very seriously, and we don't think about them in a 2035 mindset. I want people focused on readiness. I want our ships looking good. I want our sailors trained well to fight, and I don't want anybody walking around with the mindset that we're not going to have to do it for 15 years. So that, I think, part of it's mindset. We do have, in the readiness section, the first thing I talk about is ships maintenance, and we're getting 35 to 40% of our ships out of maintenance on time. That's unacceptable. I can't sustain the fleet I have with that kind of track record. We are improving. The trends are going in the right direction. We are doing a lot of data analysis, so we're looking at that kill chain. And the first place I go on a ship is to the chief's mess, because that's where that kill chain starts. The current ship's maintenance plan. They're the ones that are entering those jobs that ultimately turn into a work package that somebody's going to have to action in a shipyard. So, it does go back to the basics. But one of the things that we found is, in terms of maintenance, is that in terms of looking at a substantial amount of data, we've concluded so far, and I do take this to be a conservative estimate, that 25 to 30% of our delays are due to bad planning and forecasting up front. And so there are things that we definitely need to do within the lifelines of the United States Navy to improve our performance, and we absolutely can get after it, and we are getting after it. And then there's the partnerships we have with shipyards, both private and public, that we're also getting after. Everything from investing in their infrastructure to their workforce to processes. You know, as an example, recently we came up to 85% readiness with our F-18 strike fighters, our Super Hornets. And we didn't throw a lot of money at that problem. We were down in probably a 50% readiness percentile. It was all about process. It was all about what can we fix inside the lifelines? What can the people in those maintenance shops fix inside their own lifelines to make us better? So I'm an optimist with respect to that. Let me just pause there. I kind of camped out on maintenance for a few minutes, but it's just an example of kind of the near-term focus. Certainly integration with the United States Marine Corps is another one. You know, one of my monikers that I talk about, and I meet with the Commandant almost every day, is Integrated American Naval Power. And so I really appreciated his guidance, which came out right before my testimony, and put a little pressure on me. But it really has caused me to think, and from the top levels of the Navy to drive integration. And so now it's not uncommon for me to walk into a meeting in the OpNav staff and for there to be 3 senior Marine officers in that meeting. One of the things we're doing, if I could just shift the future fleet for just a second, is that when I came into the job, we were doing a force structure assessment. The last one we did was in 2016, and that, of course, informs a 30-year shipbuilding plan. And so based on what the Commandant wrote in his guidance, I approached him about presenting to the Secretary a proposal that we do an integrated force structure assessment, not coordinated, integrated. And so this is the Navy and Marine Corps analysts together. And so we're about to produce that assessment. We fast-tracked it this fall. We already had a running start. It was bringing the Marine Corps in closer with us. And we ran it through joint scenarios this fall, the same joint scenarios that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is using for a global integrated exercise. He just ran in Newport 2 weeks ago. So we're trying to stay consistent with the baseline that both OSD Cape and the Joint Staff are using as well. And the other thing we're introducing in this integrated force structure assessment is unmanned. So typically a force structure assessment is completely sited on programs of record. But I know that the future fleet, which I'm sure that you want to dive into, sir, has to include a mix of unmanned. The current, we can't continue to wrap $2 billion ships around 96 missile tubes and think we can do that in the numbers that we need to in order to fight in a distributed way against a potential adversary that is producing capability and platforms at a very high rate of speed. And so we have to change the way we're thinking. So we've introduced unmanned with some assumptions into that force structure analysis. My goal, my aspiration, is that force structure analysis not sit on the bench for 3 years, but that we continue to update that every year through experimentation, right? Through the investments we're making, I would say modest investments and calculated investments in unmanned experimentation right now, so that actually informs our investment every year in a responsible way. So let me pause there after that rant. I'm taking up all the airtime, sir.
Well, the title of today's conference is, Are We Building the Naval Power the Nation Needs? Mm-hmm. And inside your Frago, you list 3 core capabilities, or core advantages, I'm sorry. So you talk about the Columbia, maintaining mastery of the undersea domain, mm-hmm. and maintaining formidable forward presence through through the aircraft carrier fleet. So I'd like to ask you a question on each of those 3
Sure.
core advantages. One of the big dangers, it seems to me, during the 20s, and we've been talking about this now for 5 or 6 years, is that the Columbia program is going to exert such a disproportionate impact on the naval shipbuilding plan that it could skew everything that you may want to do in terms of redesigning the fleet. How are you going to approach that problem so that we don't have another Ford, for example?
It's unavoidable. And so if you go back to the 80s, when we were building Ohio, the 70s and the 80s, it was about 35% of the shipbuilding budget. Columbia will be about 38 to 40% of the shipbuilding budget in the future. It doesn't matter if you take a look at the most recent nuclear posture review or if you go back to preceding administrations. The seaborne leg of the Trident is absolutely critical, and so we have to replace it. By the time that we get Columbia's in the water and operational, the Ohio class is going to be around 40 years old, and so we have to replace that strategic leg. That has to come out of our budget right now, and so those are the facts. So I have to account for that. At the same time, I'm trying to make, precise investments in other platforms, both some of them will look like the ones that we're building today, like DDG Flight 3s, but there's also an unmanned aspect to this, and I do remain fairly agnostic about what that mix needs to look like. But I do know, based on the analogy I gave a few minutes ago about the $2 billion ship around the 96 tubes, we do need to change the way we're thinking. I do think that likely I do think we need an aviation combatant. What the aviation combatant of the future looks like, I don't know yet. I think there's going to be a requirement to continue to deliver seaborne launched vehicles through the air that'll deliver an effect downrange. I do think that that'll likely be a mix of manned and unmanned. The platform which they launch from, I'm not sure what that's going to look like. I think we need to continue to invest in undersea ballistic missile capability. I think we need the right mix of both surface and undersea unmanned and manned, as well as logistics platforms in number to support the way we want to fight in a distributed way. So we need to experiment more with unmanned, and we need to do it with greater speed. And we're going to fail, and that's the uncomfortable part of this, right? That we will learn as we're going. But if I go back to the integrated force structure assessment, that I do want to experiment, I'm asking people to be patient with that. I do want to, there are lessons to tear out of what Admiral Wayne Meyer did back in the 70s and the 80s, right? He did a lot of land-based testing. He did a lot of, he took a ship, and I forget the name of the ship on the West Coast that, he put missile launchers on, and then he, Moorestown, New Jersey became a shore site. There is value in a deliberate approach like that. Yeah, we want to move at speed, but I don't want to be reckless. So I hope I'm making some sense to you in terms of, the fleet's too small, right? Our capabilities are stacked onto too few ships that are too big. And that needs to change over time. We've made significant investments in aircraft carriers, and we're going to have those aircraft carriers for a long time. And I get uncomfortable when people, and I know you want to get to carrier vulnerability, and most of that stuff's highly classified, but in terms of just taking a look at it like a physics problem, right? Hypersonics go really fast and they travel at long range. Carriers can only go this far, so carriers are going to go away. A very simplistic way to look at a problem set. I've been in 2 big war games up in Newport since I've been here, and I absolutely believe, and one of the reasons I want to bring back annual fleet exercises is because we have to wring more out of what we have today in terms of how we're going to fight with it. There are alternative con-ops that we have to develop and that we have to test, and we're not going to do it during certification of carrier strike groups for combat deployment. We have to do that in big-scale exercises. That's what we did years ago. We need to go back to experimentation. That's where we're going to experiment with unmanned. That's where we're going to experiment with new capabilities. We absolutely have to do that, and then to leverage that and where we're going in the future. But back to the carriers for just a second. People don't give us enough credit for the gray matter between our ears in terms of warfighting. And we have some phenomenal leaders out there at every level who are thinking about how we can fight better. The fleet that we have today is going to be the same fleet that we have 75% of it in 2030. And so we have to think about how we get more out of it, right?
Since you jumped to the carriers, let me pull on that string just a little so you know. I agree a lot of the vulnerability studies are classified, but I think there's a general consensus that the threat to surface vessels and the carrier is growing over time.
Yep.
and they're extraordinarily expensive, as the acting secretary talked about this morning. So they represent an enormous opportunity cost. Given that you are pretty confident, it seems, that an aviation platform will be a central part of the fleet, have you made any initial judgments on how big the big deck carrier fleet will be?
No, I haven't. And so that'll come over time. But no, I don't have a predisposed notion on how big it ought to be. I will say that it's unfair to think about the maritime fight in as a single domain, right? And so how we're going to leverage space, we don't do anything in the U.S. military today without leveraging space. We can't. We have to. So we have to learn how to leverage it when we fight, not just in day-to-day operations. It's the same thing with cyber, and why I want to give tactical cyber teams, small tactical cyber teams, to fleet commanders, so that we can confuse the enemy and put ourselves in a position of advantage in a fight right off the bat. We have to do a better job at integrating all domains into how we're going to fight. It gets back in. It's not just wringing everything you can out of the iron that we have. It's leveraging everything you can out of the joint force that we have and out of the all-domain fight that we know we're going to get in.
The third core competency you talked about was maintaining your mastery of the undersea domain. And one of the things that struck me most about the 2016 force structure is it had a 600 ships Navy worth of guided missile cruisers and destroyers, but only half of a 600 ships Navy worth of attack submarines. And when you see what's happening with the Russian undersea fleet and just the technological trend lines in the Western Pacific, that seems wildly out of balance to me. So have you given any thought on how you might redress this balance, or are you comfortable right now with the way we stand?
Yeah, I'm not comfortable with where we stand. I do think we have an advantage in the undersea, and we've got to leverage that advantage, and we can't give it up. So we are, you saw the announcement, many of you saw the announcement 2 days ago for Virginia Block 5. Recognize that there's also a limitation in terms of how fast you can pump out submarines, right? Or how fast you can pump out ships. And so, so that's, there are certainly anything we do has to be fiscally informed, but also the Defense Industrial Base is a key partner for us, right? And they have challenges as well, and we are working very closely with them together because we succeed or fail together. And so I would just say that A, I'm not satisfied. B, it deserves a deeper look in terms of those numbers.
Now, the one thing that stood out to me as a Marine, and given all of the things that you and the Commandant have been talking about on an integrated fleet, is that naval maneuver or expeditionary maneuver was not one of the core competencies that was listed in the Frago.
That's fair.
But listening to you and the Commandant, it seems like that part of the fleet might have an enormous change over the near to midterm, with the Commandant speaking of different platforms and more distributed maneuver. I know it's early days, but have you given any thought? Can you give the audience an inkling of what you might be thinking in this regard?
Yeah, so how do you use, so the Commandant has made the statement that how does the Marine Corps best serve the fleet? And so if we think about a fight in the maritime against a peer competitor, how can we use Marines ashore to help us both control and deny the maritime to an adversary? That's what Expeditionary Advanced Basing Operations is all about. The Marines are very good at that. They're thinking about the types of platforms that they need, how they will move in, let's say, an island hopping kind of scenario in order to provide fires, whether they're non-kinetic or kinetic, in order to set the conditions to reach objectives in a campaign that could be largely maritime focused.
You've mentioned it already, but MUM-T, manned and unmanned teaming and autonomy. Are you thinking right now of this as more of an adjunct to manned platforms, or do you see them becoming more of a central component of a future battle force?
Yeah, I think they have to be a central component of a future battle force. I think the first biggest challenge for us, though, quite frankly, is Joint All-Domain C2. And so when we've talked about, we're building netted weapons and We're building netted platforms and netted C2 nodes, but we don't have an adequate net. And so that's missing, and it's a critical piece. And we typically talk about that in the 2033 to 2035 timeframe. We are working most recently over the past month very closely with the Air Force, because they've done some good work, we've done some good work. As I sit down with the 4 stars, and we have two admirals that are combatant commanders, and typically they only have to say one word during those discussions: joint, joint, joint. And they say it repetitively. And so as the Navy is making investments on a Navy tactical grid or an operational architecture that's Navy-centric, it's not going to work, which led to immediate discussions with the Chief Staff of the Air Force and a handshake that we would team our forces together and perhaps our budget lines together and start working towards a joint solution set fast in a Manhattan Project kind of way, because we need it. It's a serious gap that we need to close.
And how, have you given any thought on how we educate Congress? Because they often say, hey, I'll give you the large unmanned surface vessel once you give me the CONOPS. And your answer back to them is, well, I need the ships to develop the CONOPS.
Yeah.
And they don't like to change ship counting rules.
Yep.
They're very, very skeptical. Have you thought about how you're going to approach Congress with this? Because it seems to me that it's going to have a big impact on what you want to do.
So interestingly, and I know you can relate to this, most discussions I have in the Hill that deal with ships are viewed through the eyes of the Gerald R. Ford, which, by the way, I'm extremely bullish on, and you should be as well, because it's a phenomenal capability that's heading in the right direction. That said, we do have some challenges with Ford that we're working very closely. We're working through with our partners, and again with great momentum. But we did make some mistakes, right? We should have done some more land-based prototyping, as an example, with the elevator systems, and we didn't do that. And there are reasons why we didn't do that I don't want to revisit. But as I talked about the Wayne Meyer model earlier, I think if we show Congress that we can approach this in a responsible kind of way, test a little, learn a little, learn a lot, and then regroup. I think that we can do this in a deliberate way, but at speed, that we can show Congress that we're working at this responsibly. I'm not asking for money to build a class of unmanned ships. I'm asking for money to experiment step by step with capabilities that we know that we can put on them. So I don't have a better answer than that right now, and I'm being completely honest with you, because I understand the hesitation to give us money for stuff that might fail. And as you know, a wounded project on the Hill typically leads to a mark. And so how do you get to that kind of discussion? You just have to be transparent and be truthful. I got an adversary that's moving at flank speed. I got to move at flank speed. I need your help to get there. I'm trying to do it in a responsible way. I don't have an agenda other than to try and move out faster, but in a responsible way.
One of the things that jumped out the most to me in your Frago, and the one that I was most excited to read, was your discussion of the large-scale exercises and fleet problems and wargaming. Yeah. Can you tell the audience a little bit about this? This seems to me to be one of the real big ideas of the Frago.
Yeah, I really have to give credit to people like Admiral Davidson that put a lot of thought into fleet-centric warfare, right? And that fleet commanders ought to own the physical and virtual battle space that they're responsible for, and they ought to drive the fight. So that was a concept that led to fleet design about 4 or 5 years ago, and then out of that came distributed maritime operations, and I would argue that the Marine Corps' expeditionary advanced basing operations is almost hand in glove with those concepts. But we need, in order to be able to fight as a fleet, if you believe that's the way we need to fight, and we can't continue to do strike groups and ARGs around the world in these constabulary positions, right? At some point, we're going to have to bring together the garage band and make it work at the fleet level. That we have to exercise as a fleet, and we've made great investments in our maritime operational centers at those fleet commands, and they are a great capability. that gives that fleet commander the ability to fight. And so we need to exercise it. We need to do more than war game it. We need to exercise it. And the only way to do that is with iron out there at scale. And so my vision is to bring back, and this will be the first one this summer, Large Scale Exercise 2020, but is to try and do it on an annual basis with several strike groups, both amphibious readiness groups and carrier strike groups, and to run it from the fleet level. And to, as a pilot in this first one, I want to establish an information warfare cell to integrate cyberspace and influence operations inside that MOC, so that we begin to integrate that better at a higher level, and then look at what we can do to scale that.
You also you just mentioned a little bit about live virtual constructive training, and that's another section in the Frago, and that's another very exciting thing. So we should expect more money to be shifted into this. And
so we learned a lot after the collisions in 17, and the money we put in live virtual has really, really paid off. We're sending officers officers to ships right now who are outperforming some of their peers that have been on those ships that haven't had live virtual training in a substantive kind of way. We've got a JOOD course right now, a Junior Officer of the Deck course, that's producing ship handlers that actually know how to handle a ship before they get on board, and it's been remarkable. And so if you walk in to these simulators, and a lot of this is leveraging gaming technology, right, that's already out there. It is so lifelike, and it's fun, it's lifelike, it's productive, and we need more of it. We need more of it from a, not just a ship driving perspective, but a war fighting perspective, right? Simulators.
Well, I could just keep going forever.
Yeah.
I want to give the audience a couple
Sure.
chances, but I did want to have one more question. I mean, you were the commander of the 10th Fleet, the J3 at U.S. Cyber Command, so you have a deep understanding of this. So you talk a lot about extending the digital competitive advantage we have, and you've already talked about the netted architecture. Do you have can you fill the audience in on any more about your thinking there?
As I was thinking about the guidance, I was thinking, well, and there was probably an expectation out there when I became CNO that one of my main tenets would be, digitization, and it is, but it's wrapped up in everything. And so my view is digitize everything. And what we're doing right now in manpower, in the manpower area specifically, has been fantastic. And so we've taken, as an example, and for those of you that are either retired or still active duty, we took some almost 80 websites, 60 some odd entry points, 5 data warehouses, and we collapsed that into an integrated cloud environment, right? That allows us to, with one entry and exit point, using mobile applications and microprocessing. And so we're just doing what everybody else is doing, but we're collapsing all of this stuff. When it takes you 30 minutes to put in a leave chit. So now a sailor can do their travel claim, at their kitchen table, just like you would expect they should be able to. Or that somebody that's retired should be able to access that system as easily as somebody that's active duty. That is probably our best example of where people need to head. But it doesn't necessarily need to be centrally managed at OPNAV. I mean, these are efforts that can, if you give, the standards certainly have to be centralized. But in terms of the efforts themselves, they don't have to be centralized. And so there's a lot that we're going to do with digitization. We just had one of the biggest cloud contracts in the country that essentially modernized our financial services inside the Navy as well. So I think, and the Secretary may have spoken a little bit about this morning, but that's the direction we're heading in. Digitize everything.
I'll be asking the audience, we have about 15 minutes, so if anybody wants to make their way to the microphones, I'll get right to you. CNO, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you would like to talk to the audience about before we shift over to the audience?
Yeah, well, I anticipate a question on this. So on Monday, I released a message about integrity and standards of conduct. And the reason I did that is fairly obvious to everybody based on what we've been through in the past month and a half. But having been through this now deeply particularly in the last 3 or 4 weeks, I saw it as an opportunity. And when I've been speaking inside the lifelines of the Navy recently, I've been spending a lot of time talking about the profession of arms. And that profession of arms is really grounded on 2 main things. And one is specialization. And if you think about the al-Baghdadi raid a month and a half ago, there's no better example than what the United States military is capable of when you take a look at a raid like that and how successful it was. But the other pillar that's equally important is our standard and code of conduct and the accountability that goes hand in glove with that. And so this is a chance for us within certain communities and broadly across the Navy to think about what makes us a profession and why it is so important that we take our values to work every day, home every day, and especially in the combat. That's what the nation expects, and it's easy to take that for granted, but it's why the world looks at the U.S. military as the standard. It's because we truly are professionals, and I think sometimes we take that for granted. So the events recently have given us the opportunity, I think, to reflect and to get after this and not forget and use it as a learning opportunity. Right? We've made some mistakes in some communities, in particular, but it's something that we have to dig back into and not just put it behind us, because there'll be the tendency is to put stuff behind you in your wake and just keep on going, and stuff like this you just can't.
All right, we'll switch over to the audience. I'd like I just asked that the questions be crisp and not be a statement or a speech, so that we can get as many questions as possible within this last 15 minutes. Please.
Thank you. Jeff Shogel with Task and Purpose. The Harry S. Truman is headed to the Middle East. Mm-hmm. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that other ships could be going there as well. Does the Navy have the ability to surge more than one carrier in the Fifth Fleet AOR if the President decides to intensify the maximum pressure campaign against Iran?
Yeah, the short answer is absolutely yes. So there is a requirement that we have, and that we have a requirement that's dictated by the Secretary of Defense in terms of our readiness posture with our carrier strike groups, our crew des, our air wings, and we meet that requirement. We also have the ability to surge if we have to. If there is a requirement to surge, we will be ready to surge.
And I apologize for having to ask about something so terrible. Do you have any more details about the event at Honolulu, the shooting last night?
Well, it was an active duty service member who was part of the crew of the USS Columbia, submarine in dry dock in Hawaii. The incident happened at the shipyard. We don't have a lot of details yet. We know that we're pretty sure that he acted alone, but we don't have those details yet. There's a lot of interviews ongoing right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Ben Warner from the U.S. Naval Institute.
Sure.
Over here. One of the things I was hoping you could talk a little more about is manpower, especially not just recruitment, but retention. Because I know from talking to CNP's staff, especially when you talk about some of the people like hard to get specialty, cyber, nuclear, you guys it's a challenge to keep those folks in the Navy. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you're going to do or what your plans are to improve retention.
Yeah. So as you may know, we just did a deep dive on seashore rotations, and we made changes across, I think, 23 ratings in terms of lengthening sea tours, but taking a look overall in terms of career path of a balance, almost equal seashore rotation. And in a number of other ratings, almost an equal amount, we actually reduced the amount of sea time. So we think that that's a benefit in terms of retention. The laser focus that we've had over the past year on housing is another issue. In fact, interestingly, the metrics that we look at now for housing, I'm pulling into our readiness portfolio. And so, if we truly believe that readiness begins at home, and we have those metrics, and that we retain families and not just sailors, that we have to start looking more deeply at that. In terms of you talked about cyber. we took a look at a aptitude test that we piloted at 10th Fleet, and I just recently raised the question again on whether or not we can use it service-wide, so that we're not testing people for specific cyber skill sets, but whether or not they have the aptitude. We do this with a language exam, right, to see if people have the aptitude for foreign languages. And so, do we already have the talent resident in the force that we can leverage to put against these problems, and we don't even know it?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello, Admiral. My name is Hampton Dowling, just an independent consultant. I'm really excited about how you brought back the idea about fleet exercises. I used to be the Land Fleet X scheduler, but that's when we had 234 ships in the Atlantic Fleet. It's a little bit different. Any thought, as you look forward about changing the way we think about the way we think, any thought about bringing Gitmo back,
Yeah.
utilizing Roosevelt Roads, because
Yeah.
it's the deepest harbor, it's the biggest runway system in Latin America,
Yeah.
and then bringing back the Marshalls, Midway, and Tinian. You know, it helps beneath the deck plates, as well provides the platforms for experimentation.
Thanks. So one of the things I didn't touch on, but it's under the warfighting section, is a tasking of fleet forces to take a deeper look at how we generate readiness. So this specifically gets to the fleet response plan, right? That was designed in 2012 before the National Defense Strategy, and there's a number of things we have to do to generate readiness, right? We need a rotational fleet. We need to be able to surge. We need to be able to provide, hopefully, stability for our sailors and their families. We need to be able to recover after a surge or after a crisis. So we need to be able to account for all that. The inputs into that quadratic equation have changed over the past years, and so now all the combatant commander operational plans have been updated. Number one. Another big change have been globally integrated base plans that have been developed by the Joint Staff along with the combatant commanders. So essentially, the globally integrated base plan for, let's say, North Korea doesn't just flow forces from the O plan for that particular fight. What it does is it sets the globe across the 5 problem sets, right? China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, and counter VEO, in a way that allows us to do 5 missions, right? Defend the homeland, deter strategically, deter conventionally, respond to threats, and assure our allies and partners. And so we're not just looking at these problem sets. These are global problem sets. And the fight against China or Russia is going to be a global fight. We're going to come at them. We're going to make it. We're going to try and create strategic dilemmas. But we can't ignore the other problem sets and just flow everything and just play, grade school soccer. So those factors will go into the SecDev's guidance on what those readiness levels need to be. And so that's why, because that quadratic equation's changed, I'm not confident that the current system that we have is going to be able to generate the forces that are going to be required for the nation. And so we're going to take a look at that. And part of that, you sit back and you say, well, where can we gain more efficiencies? Maybe it is in terms of how we train. Maybe it is going back to the Caribbean to do JTFXs for an extended period. Do those, take that carrier strike group and basically take them for 2.5 months or whatever it takes, and basically get them up to speed. Do we gain any efficiencies out of doing that? I talked about the perform the plan piece a little bit in terms of what we're doing with data analytics and maintenance. Will that squeeze any time and make us more efficient? So we are taking a look at it. Long answer to your question about Gitmo, but it's kind of a bigger problem set.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, so we'll go to you, and you'll have the last word.
Hi, Admiral. Mallory Shelbourne with Inside Defense. I'm a reporter. Question for you about the integrated force structure and working with the Marine Corps. You mentioned the timing of the planning guidance from General Berger and the fact that you're doing an integrated force structure and not a coordinated force structure. And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate both on how Berger's planning guidance may have influenced the work you did on yours, and also how you're making sure that this integrated force structure is conducted in such a way that the Marine Corps and Navy are really doing it together.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm going to give you a short answer only because I'm being followed by Admiral Kirby, and his team is actually leading that work. And I don't mean to deflect the question, but the Commandant's Guide was strike of the obvious, right? I mean, how would you not want to leverage? How would you not want to bring the Marine Corps into this if they're already willing to improve the way we're going to fight together? We also need to improve the way we plan together, and eventually the way we budget together. And so that's a good piece of this. So this is a shared effort.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, sir. Last question.
Good morning, Admiral Gilda. Greg
morning.
Zahner, retired Air Force.
Hey, Frank.
Good to see you, sir.
See you.
The acting secretary talked about how trying to improve agility and speed and all that stuff. Are there any internal OpNav staffing, restructuring, or concepts or projects that you're doing to try to help internal to your staff that may work on those kind of focus items that you and he both discussed?
Yeah, thanks. If I could just, large-scale exercises, so not my idea. I'm leveraging on something that Admiral Richardson had already been thinking about. On the, and Admirals Grady and Aquilino are already working towards. I just felt like we needed to do them more frequently. The question you asked about, are we doing anything structurally? The OpNav N7 is a really, really important move. And the reason it is because the Joint Staff now, if you take a look at the way, what the Joint Staff is focused on in terms of, now leading the Joint Capabilities Assessment every year, right? And then that drives how we're taking a look through war games and exercises on capability gaps that we need to close. It eventually, and not necessarily coming up with solution sets in terms of platforms, but what capabilities does the Joint Force have to invest in? We had nothing in the Navy side that would mesh with that function. And so the OpNav N7, along with the education piece that Stu Munch is working on with the Naval University system, brings that together. The other thing that we just started on OpNav staff is a battle rhythm that includes a functional meeting every single day, so that I'm bringing the right stakeholders together to get after stuff, naming who the supported entity is and who the supporting entities are to those efforts, so that we get at stuff at a high rate of speed. So, but I'm not making any gigantic organizational changes.
Well, CNO, this has been terrific. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts this morning.
Thank you.
And the Navy is lucky to have you.
Thanks.
So I just ask that everybody join me in thanking the CNO for sharing his thoughts with us this morning.
Thank you.
We thank CNO and Secretary Work, and we'd like to give them each a copy of Chinese Communist Espionage, Naval Institute Press book by Peter Mattis and Matthew Brazil. And we're just going to go right into the next session, but we want to thank them one more time. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thanks, Pete. Thank you for having me. Yeah.
Okay. So Senator Kaine is in the House. I just need to do a quick introduction. It's my honor to say that he was elected to the Senate in 2012 and serves on the Armed Services, Budget, Foreign Relations, Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committees, and he's a ranking member of the Armed Services Readiness Subcommittee. The senator from one of the states that's most closely associated with the military, the father of a Marine. He plays an important part in drafting defense strategy and in resourcing defense. He's a particular advocate of veterans and taking care of veterans. So let us all thank and welcome Senator Tim Kaine for joining us today.
Well, good morning to everyone. It's a great day to come and exit out of a SASC committee meeting for a few minutes to come and share with you. And I really appreciate, Pete, the opportunity to come and just offer my thoughts on the topic. Are we building the naval power the nation needs? And I figured I'd focus on two aspects of the question, the things that come top of mind to me. You're going to have plenty of good people today to talk about platforms and innovation and technology. I want to talk about budgets, and I want to talk about manpower, and so that's what I'll do. And I know that there are some on later panels who will touch on these matters too. So from the congressional side, actually congressional and executive, we're not really building the naval power the nation needs so long as we continue to have such serious budgetary dysfunction at the federal level. I'm not saying anything to you that you don't know and understand. Everybody here knows the long-term negative impacts of unpredictability of CRs or shutdowns or threatened shutdowns. We were having a hearing yesterday about ship and submarine repair, and the long-term repair and maintenance plan. And the comment was made over and over again that only 4 times in the last 40-plus years has Congress actually done full appropriations on time before the October 1 deadline. So we're only hitting the mark that we should hit 10% of the time. That 40-year period essentially is the modern period since the passage of the Budget Control Act in 1974. And the costs and the consequences of uncertainty are significant. As I work with my ship constructors at HI or the ship repairers, both public and private in Hampton Roads, it is just so hard to manage the complexity of workflow and workforce when there's budgetary uncertainty. The uncertainty is not just on Congress's shoulders. We're dealing with a significant challenge right now with the administration. This administration has done something that's a little bit unusual. It's patented the notion that you can declare an emergency on a non-military issue and then use that declared emergency to take money from the Pentagon. So the declared emergency of the situation at our border, which all of our military experts, when they testify to us, they say it's a big problem, it's a challenge. Some even use the word emergency, but they all clarify, but it is not a military emergency. The president has, in an odd way, used the declaration of this non-military emergency as license to take money, massive amounts of money out of MILCON. Back to the hearing we were having yesterday about trying to do this 30-year plan to do ship maintenance and repair. I really applaud the Navy. They've taken the maintenance and repair planning out to 30 years, which is really, really important. But a lot of that work, the shipyard optimization plan that the Navy has put on the table, is a 20-year, $21 billion investment, and a lot of it's MILCON. That's what they want to do, but they will only do it if Congress will appropriate the funds. And as you all know, there's a lot of competition for MILCON projects. It's not as if we're short of MILCON demands across all the service sectors. And if we're going to have the ability of a president for any reason to just declare an emergency and go and take MILCON money, that's going to be a significant challenge. So the first issue, are we building the naval power the nation needs? I think you just got to start and be self-critical. The budgetary process, whether it's Congress not really following the Budget Control Act of 1974 or coming up with a better and more workable alternative, or the administration using the Pentagon's budget as kind of the piggy bank where they'll go to meet non-military needs. And once you've breached that wall, other presidents will breach it for different reasons. Some may think we've got an emergency at the border. Some may think climate change is an emergency. Some may think gun violence is an emergency. I think we would all agree these are all serious problems. But I don't think the fact that they're emergencies should be licensed to ransack the Pentagon's budget away from the specific line item appropriations that Congress has done. So we have on our shoulders, executive in Congress, we have some things to fix. I am happy to say that as a member of the Budget Committee, I've been pretty involved with our chair, Mike Enzi, Sheldon Whitehouse, on a bipartisan bill to really go back into the 1974 Budget and Control Act and make some major changes. For example, 2-year budgeting, which is what virtually every state and local government do, so that you do your significant budgetary exercise and then you use the 2-year period to true it up if you need to, but really do the oversight that you need to do. That's one of the features of the budget bill. Another feature of the budget bill is moving to a calendar year budget. Why is it when Congress gets deals, it's always right before Christmas? It's because we've got the fiscal year set up wrong, frankly. I have a friend who's a landscape architect, and he says, if you're going to do a landscape, put all the grass down and don't put sidewalks down, and then see where people walk, and then put the sidewalks there. Where Congress walks is doing budget deals at year end. One of the reasons you don't get budget deals before October 1 is that every other year it's right before an election and people have other things on their mind. the natural time, frankly, for Congress to come together and make deals when we do deals tends to be end of the year. So there is a bipartisan budget reform bill that has that and many other budget process reforms out on the table. The Budget Committee members love it. The appropriators not so much, because I think the appropriators sort of like the fact that budget has just kind of devolved into appropriators and leadership. But I do think we owe all of you, and especially our warfighters, more predictability and certainty. I've had this discussion again and again and again with folks. Any of you who are in the industry, it's easier for you to adjust to a line item number you don't like than to adjust to an asterisk or a question mark. I mean, you may not like the line item if you're in industry or if you're a planner over at the Pentagon, but if it's a certain, you can make the adjustments, and people do. But if it's a question mark or asterisk and you don't actually know when or if you'll get an answer, it's very, very hard. So that is the first component I wanted to talk about on the are we building the naval power the nation needs. Congress and the administration have to do better on basic budgeting. The second thing I want to talk about, maybe I hear a question like that and I sort of default to my earlier life as a mayor and governor. I think about manpower. I think about human capital. Again, you're going to have plenty of people who can talk about the mix of assets that we should have, but really the asset that we have that's the most important is people. And I want to talk about two aspects of the manpower problem. One, the fact that a changing environment and unforeseen requirements will need to be rapidly addressed in the moment. Will we have an ecosystem that will enable that to happen? And then second, the fact that we've got a little bit of a crisis about the health of our young people and that so many of them cannot serve in the military. You can't build a strong Navy without sailors coming in at the beginning of their careers, and we have a health challenge among our young that we have to address. And it's interesting that both of these issues, dealing with unforeseen requirements and having a workforce that's flexible enough to do that, and then the health of our young people, are critical to our Navy, but they're both budgetary items that are largely in the non-defense side of the budget. And so one of the takeaway points that I want to make as I stand before you is probably because of sequester and the budget caps, we've gotten into a mode of thinking about the defense budget and the non-defense budget. An awful lot of what you need to build strong naval power is in the non-defense budget. And so there's sort of an artificiality about the defense, non-defense division that we've kind of maybe built up over the last few years, and that needs to be rethought and sort of knocked down. Unforeseen requirements. World War II is a great example of how late-breaking requirements in naval warfare really scrambled the equation. The war is often told as a story of battleships and aircraft carriers and long-range bombers and the atomic bomb, but there was also a series of massive amphibious invasions during World War II, ending in Iwo Jima and Borneo, and there was dramatic shortages of amphibious vehicles at some points along the war that led to some pretty significant shifts in policy. So, for example, the D-Day invasion was delayed from April of 1944 until June, and one of the main factors was there weren't enough amphibious vehicles. And here's a great quote of Winston Churchill's. This is not one of the ones he's most remembered for, but you'll appreciate it. The destinies of two great empires seem to be tied up in some goddamn thing called LSTs. That doesn't have the poetry of some of the other great Churchill quotes, but there was a set of requirements that were rapidly developing, and how do you have a workforce or industrial base that can do that? I don't know what tomorrow's LST is going to be, but we would be foolish if we didn't think that there were going to be changes that would require us to shift on the fly. And what that means is the best investments that we can make are in highly skilled and agile workforce. Yesterday, during this hearing on ship and sub maintenance, one of my colleagues, Senator Blumenthal, asked Secretary Gertz about workforce, and as soon as Gertz said this, I said, clip that quote, I want to read it tomorrow at this speech. Workforce development for the Navy is the #1 issue. Whether that's in training sailors, whether that's training our maintenance team, whether that's in the public yards, whether that's in the private yards, whether it's new construction, whether it's repair. I'm encouraged by a lot of the innovative techniques by Electric Boat, Newport News, and HII is using as well. is in our public yards to get after that. We have lost a generation of vocational skill training as a core, so rebuilding that is going to be one of the critical elements, not only for the Navy, but for the nation. I strongly believe in that. Now, we have, some wonderful examples, some best in class that we can learn from. You're going to hear from Mike Petters from Huntington Ingalls at a later panel, and I'm sure he's going to brag about the centennial of the HII apprenticeship program, which is really a model. That is a successful and impressive model, but we've got to do a lot more of it, and we've got to do it a lot earlier than apprenticeship programs. We have to really focus on, if we're going to get to 355 ships or the capacity that 355 ships would deliver, we got to start thinking about the preschoolers who are going to be building these ships, because the build-out is going to take a very long time. One piece of legislation that is underway right now that is really important to this question of manpower is the rewrite of the Higher Education Act in the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee, which is one of the committees that I sit on. The Higher Education Act, like a lot of the organic laws, we do it and then we kind of leave it alone for 10 or 12 years and we reauthorize. And when we reauthorize, it's our opportunity to think about, well, what is the workforce need that the nation faces? And if we're not going to reauthorize it for another 10 years, we ought to be thinking about not just today, but for the next 10 years. I have a proposal that is a fairly straightforward one, but thematically it's actually quite large with Rob Portman, and it begins with this sort of assessment. Why do we think higher education is just college? Why don't we view high-quality career and technical education as higher education? I gave the graduation speech at the HII Apprenticeship School graduation a couple years ago, and my speech was basically two things. I said, hey, congratulations, and I apologize to you. And so that got their interest. Well, why are you congratulating me, and why are you apologizing to me? I said, congratulations, because the admissions rate into this program, it's harder to get into this program than it is to get into Harvard. You have gained entrance and now finished one of the most exclusive educational programs in the country, and 60% of the people who get in already have at least some college when they do. So that's my congratulations. My apology, as the nation spouts statistics about the percentage of adults who have higher education degrees, we don't count you. A graduate who comes through who hasn't joined and enrolled to get an associate's degree, even though they're going to do the most sophisticated manufacturing on the planet Earth and do something really patriotic and earn a great living for their entire career. Our statistics that measure the percentage of our adults with higher ed degrees do not count you, and I apologize to you for that. Rob Portman and I have a bill that would take one of the cores of higher education funding for students, the Pell Grant, and we would make it available to students who are in high-quality career and technical programs. The Pell Grant right now, if you income qualify, you have to use a Pell Grant in a course that is 14 weeks long, which is the length of a college semester. If you want to use it for an 8-week super intensive career and technical course, you can't, even if you income qualify. Now think about it, a 14-week long college course, it's usually 3 days a week, might be an hour and a half a class period, so that's 4.5 hours times 14. We're talking about 65 hours of class time. A lot of 8-week high-intensity career and technical programs are 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, so that's 40 times 8, 320 hours, 5 times the amount of classroom hours, but you can't use a Pell Grant for it. So what we are doing with the Jobs Act is what we call it, and this is part of the rewrite of higher ed, is trying to enable that really important financial tool to also be offered to students who want to pursue high-quality career and technical training. Our largest supporters in this have been the nation's community colleges, and also many of our industry sectors have been extremely supportive of this. If we miss this opportunity in the Higher Education Act, we're going to have a hard time producing the workforce that we need to do what you're talking about today. So I would encourage you, we're kind of negotiating. Lamar Alexander, the chair of the HELP Committee, is announced his retirement at the end of 2020. Bobby Scott, the chair of the House Committee, is very, very steeped in these issues because he's from Newport News and understands these needs very, very well. So make hay while the sun shines. We've got a real opportunity to do something well, but if we don't do this HEA reauthorization right, we'll miss the opportunity to promote the workforce that we need to do this work. So that's sort of one workforce issue. Let me give you another one. In November of 1945, and this was, Congress was debating the Hill-Burton Act, and that was an act that offered federal investments for modernization of healthcare facilities around the country. President Truman sent a message to Congress, and here's what he said. As of April 1, 1945, nearly 5 million male registrants between the age of 18 and 37 had been examined and classified as unfit for military service. The number of those rejected for military service was about 30% of all those examined. So in 1945, 70% of male registrants were physically fit for military service and 30% were unfit, and President Truman thought that was sort of the kind of an emergency that needed to be brought to Congress's attention. If only we would be so lucky to be able to stand today and say the same thing. The Army, which has the largest recruitment goals of the services, produced a very detailed assessment of the recruiting market back in the fall of 2016, and in their study they found that only 29% of the population was physically qualified to serve. Almost really just like the mirror image of what was found in 1945. Among the reasons that people were deemed not qualified, physically qualified to be able to serve, and there's some overlap in these, 31% were disqualified for being overweight, 30% were disqualified for medical physical problems, 30% were disqualified for drug use. There were other issues, mental health, academic record, conduct. The lowest disqualifier was aptitude. That was not the problem. There's plenty of aptitude, but the biggest disqualifier is a variety of health-related issues. Now, these are issues that bear directly on this question of the naval power that the nation needs. And they're issues that the military or the DoD budget can't solve. They're issues that society has to solve and that we have to solve through a whole of government approach. And this is a textbook example of how the nation's defense challenges don't fit neatly into the Pentagon budget or into an artificial categorization of the federal budget as a defense and a non-defense budget. I have a bill with Senator McConnell right now that I'm really proud to work on with him to try to raise the age for all tobacco products to 21. Why talk about that here at a Naval Power symposium? Well, you can understand why. We have made great strides in reducing youth smoking. It's been a wonderful success. The public health approach to reducing youth smoking has been dramatically successful over the last 50 years. I remembered as governor of Virginia being able to have a celebration one day with the agency head in Virginia responsible because we got the news that for the first time the youth smoking rate in Virginia was below the national average. And for a state that's a big tobacco state, Virginia's top 3 in the country. Tobacco was the crop that enabled the Jamestown colony to survive after they limped along for the first decade or two. But the sad thing is virtually all the progress that we've made in youth smoking over about 30 years has been reversed in the last couple of years because of e-cigarettes. And young people who think, oh, wow, because it's not burning tobacco, I guess it's safe. And now we're having to figure out how to deal with 14-year-old addicts, which we've not really had to figure out how to do before. So Senator McConnell and I have a bill to raise the age on all related tobacco products for every population in every corner of the country to 21. We're going to have to grapple with issues like that, or thinking about phys ed requirements in schools. We're going to have to grapple with all of those questions if we're going to have the naval power that the nation needs in the future. I continue to believe, when I was doing economic development deals as a mayor and governor, it always came down to the workforce. Companies would pit me against another state on a tax rate or on an incentive package. But once one of the companies that I tried to recruit, long after the decision was made, one of the executives retired, and he and I were chatting about those competitions. And he told me, we knew all along where we were going to go. We were going to go to the place with the best workforce. It was helpful to us to have a competition to get better and better incentive packages on the table. But we knew all along where we were going to go. We were going to go to the place where we had the workforce we needed. When Amazon made their announcement of the Headquarters 2 operation in Northern Virginia, it was all about the workforce. The investment package that the governor put together was heavily investments in Virginia's higher ed system and community college system to train folks to do the kind of work that Amazon would want. But we'll be training tons of people who will never think about working for Amazon, who will get their training and decide they want to stay in Appalachia or stay in Hampton Roads. We made a commitment to them that we would train the kind of workforce they wanted, and that's why we ended up winning that significant economic development project to come to Virginia. I think about this in a lot of different ways. As Pete was introducing me, I'm on the relevant committees. I'm a mayor and governor, used to do a lot of economic development deals. I'm the son of an iron worker. I'm the son-in-law of a World War II submariner. I'm the father of a U.S. Marine. I think about it from a lot of different perspectives, but it really does come down to if Congress and the administration can get our budget right, and if we can all commit together to do the kinds of things that will demonstrate the attractiveness of the kinds of careers that you offer, and then encourage people to go into these careers and root out once and for all any stigma about career and technical jobs as being somehow secondary to going to college, we'll have the naval power we need for decades to come. That is a tall lift to say if we can do these things, then we'll have the naval power we need for decades to come. But get the manpower piece right, and then we can be confident that we'll get everything else right. Thank you a lot for having me today. And Pete, I don't know if you wanted me to take a question or two, or yeah, I'm very glad to. Thanks. Appreciate it. Please.
Hi, Senator Kaine. The acting secretary laid out a bunch of challenges from Iran, China, et cetera, et cetera. Who in our country or in the Senate administration can come up with a coherent strategy to address all these challenges? You know, after World War II, we came up with a strategy. It seems like we don't have a consistent strategy going ahead.
I think that's fair. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, I mean, there was a bipartisan strategy that involved here's how we describe the world and here's what America's role is in the world. And that was a strategy that, and it had its pluses and minuses. You know, Eisenhower worried at the end of his term whether we were maybe a little bit too focused on seeing Soviet influence everywhere, but it was a strategy, and it lasted under presidents and Congresses of both parties from basically Truman's decision to aid Turkey and Greece right after World War II all the way until the fall of the wall in 1989. We have been kind of on a case-by-case. The war on terror was sort of a strategy, but it was too narrow a strategic lens really to describe the whole important role that the United States needed to play in the world. I think the national defense strategy is a good one. I think the key is putting it into a larger context. So the way I look at the world right now is if Truman was trying to articulate sort of the Truman Doctrine in 1947, how would you articulate it today? It starts with the definition of the world. The definition of the world of that time was a Western bloc and a Soviet bloc, and increasingly other countries being sort of forced to choose between them. The way the world's set up now is we've got democracies and authoritarians and non-states. There's sort of a three-way competition. And it truly is a competition sort of for hearts and minds. I mean, the democracies, the good news is they exist on every continent, every part of the planet. Nations that weren't democracies a long time ago are. But we've often taken for granted democracies and just focused on adversaries. There's a lot of weaknesses in democracies. You know, anti-Semitism or Brexit or, Catalan separatist movements or Scottish separatist movements. Democracies are showing internal weaknesses, which is exactly what the authoritarians want. The authoritarians used to basically say, let us do our thing and don't intrude. But they're actually even more confident now, let us do our thing, don't intrude. And actually, your model, the democratic model, is just too chaotic. It's just not working. There's too much internal division. They're actually now not just trying as authoritarians to do their thing without us bothering them. They're actually making the case that the authoritarian model is the better model. And then you have non-states who threaten both the authoritarians and the democracies. It's the one area where authoritarians and nations and democracies actually have sort of common cause to defeat non-state actors. So I think you have to understand that that's the way the world is right now. And then the thing that we have to do also is we have to be realistic about what is our role and what are we willing to pay for. We can't be everything to everybody and do budget caps too. You know, we can't be the global policeman and get mad if Russia's in Syria and we want them out of Syria, but we're going to have sequester and everything to cut our budget. We have to align what we think our role should be with what we're willing to spend and what we're willing to ask our taxpayers to pay. The one thing that I think we need right now is I think democracies are in need of some love. I would almost focus more on shoring up democracies and sharing best practices among democracies. There isn't really an organization that does that. NATO is a treaty alliance, a military alliance, and there are other organizations like OECD that tend to be kind of Northern Hemisphere or Western Europe and North America focused. We need something where the democracies of the world can confidently assert the value of the model and share best practices to be stronger. Let's see, please. Yeah, right here.
Hi, sir. Megan Eckstein with USNI News.
Megan.
Yesterday's maintenance hearing that the SASC had was a pretty optimistic view of the future of ship maintenance. I wonder what you're hearing specifically from the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in your state. I know they have a pretty heavy workload this year and probably even larger next year. So I
Yes.
wonder what you're hearing directly from them and how that shapes what you might want to do in the committee.
Well, it's a great question, and it loops back to the 2 points that I mentioned. So what I hear from my shipbuilding and ship repair community is all the time is budgetary certainty. Please, you know, they don't like being in CRs for 6 weeks or 2 months, much less deep into a fiscal year. And so the certainty issue is so important. There are just few things as complex as the scheduling of ship repair and when the ship is in and when it's out, and how do you keep your workforce intact and not have to lay people off and then hope you can hire them back. So I certainly hear the budgetary certainty thing, and that's one of the reasons on the budget committee that I've been so excited about trying to work on the budget bill. Interestingly enough, this will tell you something about how dysfunction the budget is. This bipartisan budget reform bill that we passed out of committee a couple weeks back was the first truly bipartisan bill that got passed out of the budget committee in about 30 years. The budget document that tends to get passed is a majority wish list, and then there's a minority report, and it's a completely partisan thing. So that's the first one. And then the second thing I hear from my community is the manpower issues. Now, the nice thing is we have a big enough ecosystem in Hampton Roads that, you know, from Huntington Ingalls to small family-owned ship repairs and everything in between, they're doing a good job of getting the stakeholders, which include all of the K-12 school systems in the Hampton Roads area. There's a dozen or more local governments with school systems. The community colleges, there's 2 big community colleges in the area. There's the 4-year colleges, Hampton, Old Dominion University, Christopher, Newport, William and Mary, Virginia Wesleyan. They're doing a good job of pulling them all together to sort of scope out what the workforce needs are. Secretary Gertz gave us a challenge about a year ago. He said, look, this work's going to be done somewhere. If you want it done in Hampton Roads, then you have to have the workforce to attract it to Hampton Roads, and my stakeholders have taken that on. But those are the 2 issues I hear from them: budgetary certainty and how can we proactively grow the workforce that we need.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, I'm glad to.
Yes, I'm Russell King, formerly a surface line officer on the aircraft carrier Midway.
Good to see you,
Recently, a delegation from the Okinawa legislature came to the United States protesting the building of a Marine Corps base there. But if I look at the chart of the Pacific, Okinawa seems uniquely well-positioned strategically to stop the hegemonic expansion of China's Great Wall of Sand. How do you balance strategic considerations and local considerations in foreign basing?
Yeah, no, what a challenging question. I mean, and you ask it about a challenging example, but then you ask the general question. Okinawa, and I will say, the Okinawa issue is not one where I have really dug in and feel like I'm the expert on. There are other members of the committee, and they tend to be members of the committee from more Pacific states who've really focused on the Okinawa issue, and I haven't as much. But the big issue of how do we balance our strategic concerns with meeting needs of local populations is absolutely critical. because I think the most important thing in military power these days is alliances, we can't sort of insist that we have to be somewhere at somebody else's sufferance. The one thing that we have that I think is still a huge strategic edge over China and Russia is we've got alliances where people really want to be our partners. China and Russia can kind of buy partners or cower people into partnership, but it's a very different thing than the system of alliances that we have. And so in any instance where we're looking at basing or deploying assets, we really have to try to meet local concerns and needs, because that's the way you maintain an alliance structure that is the ultimate strategic advantage we have over our opponents. That doesn't give you a cookie-cutter answer to each situation, but we can't long-term be somewhere over the objections of local communities. We have to make it work for them as well as it works for us. Great. Thank you so much. Good to be with you today.
Senator, thank you. We know your time is precious. You popped out of a committee meeting to come over here and share your time. We have one book for you, Chinese Communist Espionage, Naval Institute Press book. But thank you again, sir. We appreciate it. Another hand for Senator.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, we have time for a little break. We'll be reconvening on the hour, so we have about 15 minutes. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. If you please retake your seats, we'll get started with the final panel discussion. My name is Bill Hamblett from the Naval Institute. I'm the editor-in-chief of Proceedings magazine. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce the moderator of the panel that will address the question, what are the steps to integrate force structure, architecture, shipbuilding, and sustainment? No small feat. Mr. Brian Clark served 25 years as a Navy submariner and now is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. At CSBA, he has led studies in naval warfare, electromagnetic warfare, precision strike, and air defense. In response to the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act, he led one of 3 Navy fleet architecture studies that assessed the Navy's future needs and the implications for new technologies for fleet design. Prior to joining CSBA in 2013, Mr. Clark was a special assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations and director of his Commander's Action Group, where he helped develop Navy strategy and implement new initiatives in electromagnetic spectrum operations, undersea warfare, expeditionary operations, and personnel and readiness management. Please join me in a warm welcome to Mr. Brian Clark.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Bill. Thank you to the Naval Institute for putting on this terrific event and for having some great speakers. And I'm really honored to be up here today with some of the leaders in the U.S. Navy and in industry that are trying to build the future fleet. And I'd like to introduce them right now so we can move on with our panel. First, Vice Admiral Jim Kilby is currently the Deputy CNO for Warfighting Requirements and Capabilities. He's a native of Pound Ridge, New York, and a 1986 graduate of the United States Naval Academy. He's been a surface warfare officer for his career prior to gaining flag rank, and served on numerous surface ships, mostly cruisers and destroyers. Commanded USS Russell, where he was awarded the James Stockdale Award for Inspirational Leadership. And his first flag assignment was command of Naval Surface and Mine Warfare Center out in San Diego. And then he commanded the Carl Vinson Strike Group before becoming the Director of Warfare Integration at 9I, and then subsequent to that, his current position. Lieutenant General Eric Smith is currently the Commanding General of Marine Corps Combat Development Command and the Deputy Commandant for Combat Development and Integration. He's from Plano, Texas, and graduated from Texas A&M University through the ROTC program. He is commanded at every level in the Marine Corps, at the battalion level, regiment, division, and Marine Expeditionary Force level. Most recently, he was commander of 3rd MEF, which is very relevant to the Marine Corps' current challenges and force structure development. He was also the senior military assistant to the Secretary of Defense on his operational tours. Mike Petters is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Huntington Ingalls Industries, the America's largest shipbuilding company and provider of manufacturing, engineering, and management services to the nuclear energy, oil, and gas markets. He's also a member of the HII Board of Directors. Mr. Petters was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy in 1982, served on the George Bancroft, the proud USS SSSBN, and spent 5 years in the Navy before moving on to HII, where he's been for more than 30 years. He currently serves on the board of directors also of the Naval Academy Foundation, the National Association of Manufacturers, and on the board of advisors for the Center of New American Security. And then last, Ron O'Rourke is from the Congressional Research Service, where he has been an analyst for more than 30 years. He is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the Johns Hopkins University, where he received his BA International Studies, with a valedictory graduate of the university's Paul Nietzsche School of Advanced and International Studies, where he received his MA in the same field. He has received numerous awards from the government and from the Library of Congress during his time at CRS, including the Distinguished Service Award from the Library of Congress and the Superior Service Award from the Navy for his work as an analyst on naval issues. He is also a winner of the U.S. Naval Institute's Arleigh Burke Essay Contest, which I thought was important to note here. So Ron is a well-known and well-respected analyst of naval issues, and we're glad to have him here today. So to start off the panel, I think we're going to have a series of kind of opening remarks here, but just to throw some red meat on the table for everybody to think about. The naval force today is in a state of change. That's always kind of the case, but arguably we're at a point where we're having a greater degree of change in what we expect the Navy to do and the Marine Corps to do and how they should do it than we have in the last 20 years since we introduced a family of new surface combatants back in the early 2000s. The changes we're seeing are going to involve the integration of amphibious forces with other naval forces to a much greater degree, different ways of operating with the Marine Corps, which General Smith, I'm sure, will talk about. Thinking about the challenges of costs for the future fleet as sustainment and manpower become a growing part of the naval budget, and how do we address that in our fleet design. Thinking about how we rebalance the surface fleet to accommodate the need for more distributed operations, accommodate the need to address the challenges posed by precision weapons, including hypersonic weapons in the future. How we might restructure the submarine force as we consider the growing cost of submarines, their growing importance, but also the likelihood that we may want to have a more larger distributed submarine fleet as well, and think about how unmanned vehicles will be part of both that fleet and the surface fleet. Unmanned vehicles being a greater portion of the Navy and the Marine Corps are going to have to be something that we factor into both our force structure decision making and then also into our sustainment and manpower decisions as well. So all of these factors are in flux right now as the Navy and Marine Corps embark on developing a new force structure assessment, and industry grapples with the need to support a new fleet design and accommodate the likelihood of a flat or even declining budget situation in the future. Into this fray, our naval leaders have jumped in an effort to develop that new force structure assessment, and they've adopted a new process for doing so. So let's hear from them on how that's going and the process that they're taking to develop the fleet of the future. Admiral Kilby?
Hey, great, Brian, thanks. Well, it's great to be here today. I think I got an email from Admiral Daly, and I said it to my brother in arms here, Eric Smith. I think we got an offer we can't refuse. So it's great to be here and in this panel to discuss a lot of things that you've laid out, Brian. But first off, I'm the N9, which means the directors of test and evaluation work for me, expeditionary warfare, which includes amphibious warfare, surface warfare, submarine warfare, or undersea warfare, and air warfare, as well as another guy who I used to be called N9I, who's the integration lead of that group. So that occupies a lot of my time, is the requirements, program, and alignment of those things, those elements of naval power. Right behind that, though, is a parallel effort to create the budget cycle, and I've been, either for my misfortune or fortune, depending on how you look at it, involved with the last three budget cycle, and now soon to be the fourth budget cycle. And the consistency in those has been remarkable. Strategic deterrence, you heard it from Admiral Gilda today, readiness recovery, capability and lethality, and then capacity, and balancing all those things, but in that prioritization order, has been the consistent benchmark for us as we produce the best program we can for the Navy. So that's, I would say, in alignment with the new FRAGO and what we discussed today. I think I saw Mike Novak here today. He used to be my deputy. He invited General Berger up to our spaces last year about this time. And General Berger was the predecessor for General Smith in his current job, and he came up and saw we were working on a brief called the Maritime Fight Brief. And that was a display or an explanation of how we mapped our program to what we thought was a notional operational fight. And General Berger said, hey, I want in on this. And my boss at the time was Admiral Mers, and they started to give this brief together. And there were understudies, and I was an understudy for that brief for Congress and OSD as we've matured that over the year. I would say more feeling when Eric Smith came in, let's do it, let's integrate more. And so I want you to take away, I hope, and Eric and I typically do these things together, and I say, hey, I'll go if you go. But we want to have that understanding permeate the audience, that the conversation and interaction we have is significant, it happens often, either I going down to Quantico, which is less frequently than Eric's in the Pentagon, but we look and talk together about how we introduce naval power. So it is a fundamental difference, and I've seen it and talked to some of you to see if it's reached penetration, and I get the feeling that it has. So that is happening, and it's alive and well. Admiral Gilda said frequently at meetings, he'll see Marine 3 stars and Navy 3 stars sitting side by side. So this manifested itself for us in a very real way on 6 September when CNO and the Commandant signed out this integrated naval force structure assessment. So let's just talk about that for a minute. Force structure assessments in the past in the Navy were typically done in N81, which is our assessment division. And I won't say in isolation, but pretty much in isolation. And they would take a program and play it out, and they do it either on a 3-year or an episodic basis to go look at the Navy we were procuring or planning to procure versus a certain set of scenarios. So Commandant and CNO turned that on its head, and they said, we want you to do this together. And so talking with Admiral Lesher, who owns that process, he said, hey, Kilby, I think there's a 2-step here, and you and General Smith are the first step, which is to articulate those different elements that will play in this integrated force structure assessment. I would say there was an effort to do coordination before. There were some elements that N81 would attribute to the Marine Corps and capabilities. But now, a little shift. I'm describing from a Navy perspective what we're going to play. General Smith is describing from a Marine Corps perspective on what we're going to play to a great degree of fidelity. So at the classified level, we've created that program. And I call it baseball cards. But if you think about a baseball card, there's very specific details on the back of that baseball card for that player. So Eric's team created that for the Expeditionary Advanced Basing Operations. My team created it for unmanned systems, also for the frigate, where we played attributes and characteristics we think are important to the fight as we move forward. So that's step one, is create that piece or underlayment piece. Then we turn it over to N81, who is now campaigning that with General Smith's analysis division to create this integrated force structure assessment. There were some interesting strands in the CNO. He said, hey, I don't think this is pens down, disestablish the team, reestablish the team 3 years from now. I think this is going to be a standing team and a standing effort. And if you look at how things play in different geographies or different laydowns, we should be critical of ourselves, and we should look at those elements where things are in and out and how that impacts the campaign. So I think this is an ongoing effort. We'll be done with the first iteration here in December and then start working on the report in the new year. But I think you should expect us to continue to internally be very critical, skeptical, if you use the word, of Secretary Modly, on how we produce and introduce this in the future. Finally, I'm an optimist at heart, if you know me, but I have a pessimistic side of me. So I'm optimistic in that we have strategic guidance that's aligned and consistent and tight and helpful for us as we refocus on great power competition. I'm a pessimist when I think about continuing resolutions and the impact on those 4 priorities I gave you, which is significant the longer that CR is. And I don't think we should be Pollyannish about it. I was pleased that Senator Cain brought it up. It is on our minds. And I have a piece of paper on my desk that tells me by month what the impact is on those 4 priorities, whether it be capacity, lethality, R&D efforts, or modernization, or overhaul efforts. And that's significant and on our mind, and it should be on all of our minds. So I look forward to your questions and the discussion. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Admiral. Eric?
So I'll be as brief as I can be. I'll be somewhere between what I normally would do is just say ditto for everything Jim said, because we are not, this is about as far apart as we normally get in the Pentagon. I'm in his office. We are, well, people say relationships aren't enough to get it across the goal line, but you can't get to the goal line without the relationship. And the relationship is changing because, as a Commandant would tell you, there was an 18-year period, give or take, where the Marine Corps kind of walked away from the Navy. We didn't do it on purpose. We did it because we were required to do it for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then we came back, and our first question was, hey, you still got those amphibs? That is not how you run a relationship. So we are trying to rebuild that relationship with our Navy shipmates. And it starts at the top with General Berger and Admiral Gilda, and the next instantiation I would say is myself and Jim Kilby. And I talked to Jim more than any of the other, there's six, it's a total of 7, other 6 deputy commandants. I talked to Jim three times more than any of the deputy commandants. So between ditto and more, I'll split the difference to give time for your questions. I'll start it from the back and work very quickly at the front. What Jim said about the CR, I've been saying that as loudly and as forcefully as I can, up to and including the point of, Smith, you got to go home for saying that too much. I'm fine with that. The analogy is we're moving into December with a CR, best case, and maybe it gets solved. If it doesn't get solved, now we're into the new year. That's a third of my year gone for new starts. I mean, professionals don't do that. That is not how you take on a peer adversary. The analogy for those baseball fans here is the Nats did not beat the Stros. My wife's from Houston, so I got to be careful here. The Nats did not beat the Stros by spotting them 4 runs in the first inning. You don't, professionals don't do that, and yet we do it time after time after time. And then we ask, well, how are we lagging behind a peer competitor? No, I can show you one answer right there. The CR matters. It hurts us. It hurts industry. It hurts Mike, my ability to get to him. Hurts the folks up in York, Pennsylvania, working on the amphib combat vehicle. So the CR is huge. Commandant's planning guidance is very clear. It's about 26 pages. If you haven't read it, you should. Mine's in the back room. I carry it with me everywhere. I brought this not really to help me with my notes, but to take information from you as you ask questions, because we're going to learn as much from you as we're going to say. We don't have all the answers, but what we do know is we are a navally integrated force. We are the JFMIC, and we support the Joint Force Commander. So the Joint Force Commander says, here's my wicked problem set. The JFMIC shows up with all of our issues worked out. We're the JFMIC. What do you need from us? And I am in support of the fleets. That's what the Commandant called on us to do, to build a Marine Corps that is purpose-built to support the Fleet Commander in distributed maritime operations, specifically sea denial and sea control where we can. I don't work for myself. I work for the fleets. Happy to do so. That's who we've always been. It's who we were when I was lieutenant, a Fleet Marine Force. It's not a subordination issue. It's supporting. So the Commandant has laid out a few things. He did an article just came out this morning, War on the Rocks, where he very clearly said, these are what I would call legacy platforms, not of no utility, but I can't afford to hold all of these while investing in these. And he listed a fairly significant list of things he wants to get after. Autonomous systems, unmanned systems, lethal long-range, ground-based fires. I already shoot a missile 200 miles. It just happens to be an Army ATACMS. I have them in Afghanistan now. The Marine commander there has them. So as the littoral maneuver guy, I would assume my missiles should be able to strike a ship instead of just a land-based target. So we're just moving in what we think is a pretty common sense direction. As we talk about littoral operations in a contested environment and expeditionary advanced space operations in support of the Fleet Commander, one of my key concerns, and Jim's as well, is logistics, sustaining the naval force forward. My contribution to that is I have to be lighter. Marine Corps hasn't gotten lighter in 20 years. We've gotten heavier every day. We've added things from personal body armor up through tanks. We have to get lighter, so I put less of a burden of lift on my shipmate. There's a point when physics takes over, and so many connectors can only haul so much stuff. So one of the ways I contribute is to get lighter, and you'll see that from the Commandant. Lighter, risk-worthy platforms, less expensive, more numerous, because mass does have a quality all its own. Swarm tactics do work. We've war-gamed that. We've done some work with MITRE to show it. It does work. So that's where the Commandant's going. I'll stop there to give maximum time for your questions. But literally, if you hear it coming out of Jim, just check, ditto. I'm there, because we are literally plus or minus a degree, if that, on any issue. And I'll stop there and look forward to your questions. And thanks for having us here. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you, General. Mr. Petters.
Well, good morning, everybody. I guess my designated role on this panel is to be the industry person that sits here and says, if you could stabilize requirements and stabilize budgets, we could be really efficient. And I've been on panels before where the industry person is supposed to say that, give me the design 100% done before I start. Don't let the requirements move around throughout the process of the program. But what I'm going to tell you is probably a little bit different than that, because that's not the way we think about it. The reality is that if you let the industry drive you to that, that becomes the tail kind of wagging the dog. And in the end, you probably are not going to have the things that the warfighter needs to have, you know, at the moment that the warfighter needs to have it. And so it's a recognition on our part that says, hey, this environment's going to be really dynamic. And that means that we've got to think a little bit more about how we contract for things, how we specify things. Do we reserve information because the ship's not going to be ready for 6 years? Do we reserve that so that when the ship's coming close to being ready, we can plug and play and be what you actually need? And I think that in an environment like that, I kind of think back. You know, I'm old enough to actually remember. I grew up in Florida, so I remember the space program. We'd actually watched the launch on television. I was on the west coast of Florida. We'd watch the launches on television, then I'd go out in the backyard and I'd watch the rocket go up over the orange trees. And if you go back, this is the 50th anniversary of the landing on the moon and the Apollo program. And you think about how great that program was. Apollo 7, 8 goes to the moon, 9 does their test, 10 goes back, 11 lands on the moon. Everything went like a Swiss watch to get the guys on the moon. What nobody's talked about this year has been the Gemini program. If you go back and look at the Gemini program, what did we do? We launched Gemini, we launched a rocket about every 60 days. And I think there were 12 missions. I think there were 9 or 10 of them were manned. Every manned mission that we put up had something go wrong. I mean, something major go wrong on that mission. And until Gemini 12. So every mission has something go wrong. Everybody has to explain why it went wrong. But 60 days later, we put another one up. Within 2 years, we got through all of the testing that we needed to get through so that when Gemini 12 went the way that it needed to go, NASA clapped their hands together and said, okay, let's go to the moon. And we did. I don't know whether we still have, if we're going to be in a dynamic environment where industry's ready to support dynamics in the requirements, dynamics in the designs, dynamics in the way we're going to put things together. I'm not sure that we have the language right now to actually talk with the taxpayers and talk with our constituents to explain risk and explain that there's going to be, to do the things that you all are going to need to do to give the warfighters what they need to have when they need to have it. That's going to require us to fail. And if we're not failing, we're not pushing the envelope far enough. But I'm not sure we have the language right now to deal with that. And I think we can explore that some more in this conversation. But we have new tools. We have lots of different things inside the industry to allow us to be agile enough to be responsive. But we need to find the language that allows us room to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Petters. Mr. O'Rourke.
Well, thanks for having me. My comments will pick up on a couple of the things that you've heard from the other speakers. First, about the CR impact. This is something that I spend part of my year, most years, explaining to the members and the staff. And I have a report that has 10 or 15 pages of explanatory material about that. So if you go on the public CRS website, you can download my report on Navy force structure and shipbuilding. That's report 32665. You'll see a section in there that goes into a discussion of CR impacts in a lot of detail to pick up on what the Admiral and the General were saying. I want to start my comments beyond that by mentioning the Commandant's planning guidance, which we've gotten a little close to mentioning, but we haven't quite mentioned it too explicitly. And want to make a couple points about it. One is that the comments about force design in that document have gotten a lot of attention, but there's actually a lot of material in there about new ways of managing and training personnel. In fact, more of the document is devoted to that than to the part about force design. If you take all of this together, the very extensive comments about managing and training people and the changes in force design, and add it all together, what you get is somewhere between a total house cleaning and a complete revolution for the Marine Corps. And in that sense, from my perspective, the Commandant's planning guidance stands as the most important, most significant strategy or vision document that we've seen come from the Department of the Navy leadership since the From the Sea document of late 92 and early 93. Now, the changes to the amphibious force that are outlined in that guidance are part of a larger change in fleet architecture that Navy leaders have been hinting at over the last year, and which are being worked through in this FSA. And as Brian mentioned in his opening remarks, there are several parts of the fleet that could be affected by this. In addition to the amphibious force, we could have a very significant change in the surface combatant force architecture, and also changes in the combat logistics force, the undersea architecture, and also possibly in naval aviation and aircraft carriers, if you listen to comments that have been made by the Navy's civilian leadership. If much of this is implemented, it would amount to a once-in-a-generation change in Navy fleet architecture toward a more distributed force. So in the 2 or 3 minutes I have remaining, I just want to go over a couple points. One is, why is the Navy trying to do this? Why is the Navy moving in that direction? It seems to me there are 3 general reasons why we are seeing this. One is operational necessity, that Navy leaders have determined that this force is necessary and will be better for confronting and defeating A2, AD forces, particularly those of China. Second is technical feasibility, that it now is possible to think about having a distributed force with a lot of unmanned vehicles in it, along the lines of what Navy leaders have been talking about, because technologies for networking and for the UVs themselves have matured. And the third general reason is affordability. Navy leaders appear to be of the view that the new architecture will be no more expensive and perhaps less expensive than the current architecture. It's important to note that only a portion, only a fraction of this change is going to be visible in the FY21 budget submission that is due to Congress next February, and that's because it takes a long time to prepare budgets, and only a certain part of this could be captured in a 21 budget that had already been in preparation. So we may not see more of this until the 22 or even 23 budget submissions a year or two after that. But if these changes are implemented, it will change the mix of ships in a way that could lead to a new distribution of shipbuilding work among the country's shipyards. And this is where I want to pick up a little bit on what Mike Petters said. So if we are moving toward a change of that scale and with so many different dimensions to it, what are some things that we can try and keep in mind as we launch into that? One is to work expeditiously to reveal what the new architecture is sooner rather than later, to help clarify for industry what the new picture looks like sooner rather than later, so that they have more time to prepare for it. Second is, if you're going to build a new mix of ships, we can maybe also turn to industry and say, well, if we're building a new combination of platforms, is there in fact a new way to build them compared to the way that we have been building them? So that's a source or a dimension of innovation that we can turn to industry to look for, and maybe there's something there. So if we're going to build a different combination of ships, it may not be best to do it in the same old way that we've been building the previous architecture's worth of ships. There may be new methods there. And the third, and specifically to pick up on Mike's final point, as an adjunct to the new authorities for more rapid acquisition that Congress has passed in recent years, things like other transaction authority and Section 804, among others, we might also want to look into the question of whether the existing paradigm for assessing the outcomes of acquisition programs needs to be adjusted. And this is exactly the point that Mike was bringing up. The existing paradigm that we have for judging whether an acquisition program is successful was developed during the 20 or 25 years of the post-Cold War era. That was an era when we had luxuries of time and capability overmatch, and it led to a paradigm for assessing outcomes on acquisition programs that focused primarily, if not almost exclusively, on 3 things: avoiding cost overruns, avoiding schedule delays, and avoiding problems in testing. This is sometimes called zero defect or knowledge-based acquisition, and it's not clear that that paradigm will be the best for the new era of great power competition, where the United States is competing against capable peer competitors, most notably China, that are moving at speed to develop their own advanced new military applicable technologies. So the adjustment in the paradigm that some observers have outlined, that they have proposed would not eliminate those 3 existing metrics about avoiding cost overruns and schedule delays and problems in testing, but it would leaven the paradigm by introducing additional elements that recognize speed and innovation as additional measures of merit. In other words, they would recognize that time is a risk factor, that getting something better to the warfighter in a timely manner can be more important than getting a more perfect version of that thing to the warfighter too late to make a difference. This is sometimes called speed of relevance. And it also recognizes that innovation requires risk-taking, which was exactly Mike Peters' point, that failures in testing will occur, and that a lack of problems in testing, instead of always being viewed as a good thing, might in some cases be taken as an indication that we aren't trying hard enough to innovate. And these points aren't really new. If you think back, Frank Kendall, when he was the DoD acquisition executive, was saying much the same thing as early as 2014. That was the year that Russia occupied and annexed Crimea. It was the bell-ringing event for shifting from the post-Cold War era into the era of great power competition. So this discussion has actually been with us now for 5 years. We are 5 years into this new era of possibly thinking about doing this. But it will be the proposals coming from the Navy that will really, I think, bring this discussion to a head about whether we need to change that paradigm for how we judge the outcomes of acquisition programs. Thanks, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Ron. Those are terrific comments. So we're going to open it up to audience questions here in a few minutes. I'm going to ask a couple of questions to sort of prime the pump, but if you do have questions, you can start proceeding towards the microphones, and that'll be my signal that people have questions, so I know to turn it over to somebody. But to start with, you talked a little bit about the new force structure assessment, the new model of doing this in a more iterative, continuous basis. Reading the FRAGO that came out yesterday from the CNO, which is a terrific document, and the Commandant's Planning Guidance, and looking at the National Defense Strategy, it's apparent when you read all 3 of those that we're moving towards a new model for what we consider to be the theory of victory in warfighting, particularly against a country like China. We're moving away from what you could argue as maybe an attrition-centric model that we had previous to this era towards something that's more maneuver-centric, where we're looking at agility and complexity and dynamism as being the tools that we use to deter a country like China from mounting an act of aggression in its near abroad. Given that we're having this shift in how we fight, or how we think we're going to fight, how has that changed the metrics that you're applying when you go through a force structure assessment like you are right now?
Well, I'll start. I realize that I'm not the guy who owns the analysts that do that, and I think that separation of church and state is healthy for us. So I'll let Eric answer from, he actually has an analyst shop underneath him and the folks that generate the requirement or the attributes of these things. So I think what we have to learn from this is we set down a baseline scenario and we say, does this force mix allow us to do things differently? And then I think we have to be critical about our models. Do our models actually validate or measure the attributes of the naval force that are important, like mobility? I'm not sure they do. So once we get our arms around that, then I think this excursion piece will be interesting, right? So if we start experimenting with different laydowns or different numbers of things, I think the EABF thing is a fundamental shift, and I just want to jump on Eric's bandwagon for a minute, because typically we talk about Marines influencing into land. We don't think about them influencing the sea. So if some of that load share can be spread, I can use ships in a different manner than I would in the past. I can use sensors from the Marine Corps to close my fire control loop and vice versa. So we have to, one, model that and say, does that have an effect in the campaign? Yes. Right. Experiment, iterate. Then we have to go operate that way and then train that way. So it is a complex endeavor. But I think step one is saying we have an assumption that it will make a difference. We have an assumption that having a distributed force will make it harder for the adversary to react. And if we move and coordinate our fires, which is the whole tenet behind distributed maritime operations, that I have a mobile force where I can aggregate fires at a time and a place of choosing, that's the power of the idea. So we have to measure that out, and then we have to be, again, critical of our tools and say, is our tool antiquated? Do we need to update our tool to really understand the attribute here? That's how I'd answer that briefly.
Yeah. So very quickly, so I do own, sorry, I do own the ops analysis division. They fall underneath me, and one of the issues is that as we talk about education and kind of revamping the whole Marine Corps. Fortunately or unfortunately, I own all of that right now. I own the 2 recruit depots, the basic training, officer candidate school, the basic school, all the Marine Corps schools, War College, all that still falls under me. That consumes a lot of bandwidth. So the Marine Corps is talking about, is the bandwidth at McCitic made too broad? And should I be able to focus more on this, being the M9, more aligned to Jim Kilby, which I favor, by the way. Even though you would, quote, lose some control, that would allow you to focus on some other things and someone else be focused on the schoolhouse and the training. Right now I got a Major General named Bill Mullen who can do it 3 times better than I can ever do it anyway. And that would allow me to focus here on this. So that Ops and Analysis division is not enough to provide that analytical rigor that will stand up to OSD CAPE or to the professional staff members, or it won't have, and I love him because I got a great colonel down there named Mark Revore, but we will need the gravitas of a Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, of IDA, of CSBA. So using other folks outside of my OAD or N81 is going to be important. And as we look at the metrics that you asked about, so what are the metrics that cause a behavior change? This is hard. This is not a stick it in the gonculator, run it, and you say, well, 87% chance that if you do this, you'll get this result. How do you change the metrics of a peer adversary in the competition phase? If Admiral Stuart Munch were here, we would be talking about the competition phase. I'm trying to avoid getting on the X. I'm trying to cause cost imposition, which redirects energy from an adversary internally, not externally. That is a wicked hard problem set that we actually are looking at. We are, and I'll be candid, in this forum, there's things that I do know, things that I don't know, and things that I know that but won't say. Because it's a public forum. So we are looking at that, and we do have some assessments of what will and won't be useful at turning multiple adversaries' focus, which we won't say in this forum. But we actually are using them in the NIFSA, the Naval Integrated Force Structure Assessment, and the integrated, or in the Integrated Force Structure Assessment. 2 different things. So we are doing that, and we do have some incredibly smart people within N81, OAD, and outside agencies like Center for Naval Analysis that are doing modifications to our assessment tools to give something that will be meaningful for the Hill, for industry, and for folks like OSD CAPE.
Thank you. So as we move towards kind of a more dynamic way of thinking about how the fleet's going to fight and those implications for both fleet design and also specific platforms, it gets to what Mr. Petters was talking about, that we may have difficulty saying requirements in the traditional fashion. So right now we have a JSIDS process that is a very deliberate way of defining requirements that's looking for a point solution to address a future gap that we anticipate occurring based on a certain set of assumptions about how we're going to fight. That's clearly a different way of thinking than you're talking about right here. So Ron, you talked about the need to think about new acquisition authorities, and a lot of the benefit of those is they don't require this set of requirements to have been defined well in advance. Do you think that the Navy and the military should be going more in that direction of just coming up with ideas and running excursions and showing the value of potential new capability without having really defined it exquisitely through a requirements process beforehand? Almost just like having this goes back to Section 804 and prototyping, to say, I've got a prototype, it does this, let's throw it in the mix and see what it does with regard to our metrics for how the force is supposed to perform. Do you think that's a direction that DoD should be proceeding in? Because it's going to open up the potential for failure, like you said.
Well, what I can tell you is this: I can't make recommendations one way or the other, and I should mention that these comments are my own and they don't necessarily reflect those of my employer generally for what I say here today. What I can say is that the authorities for more rapid acquisition are now in place. There's several of them. I mean, Congress has acted on a number of occasions. The question then becomes, when programs are pursued through those mechanisms that are in place, how do we then judge their success? And that is the question that some observers have raised, that once we see the results of programs that have been implemented this way, what is the best way for judging them as a consequence of having pursued them through these new acquisition authorities and in the context of great power competition? And that was the point I was raising at the end of my opening remarks.
And so to Mr. Petters, the issue that this raises then, which is becoming something that industry is talking about now, is if DoD is going to move towards more middle tier and OTA type acquisition processes, they're not going to have a requirement and go to industry and say, I need X. They're going to go to industry and say, throw us your good ideas, and you're going to have to have done the IRAD to develop that idea. So is industry going to be willing to put the money and the effort into developing a prototype, essentially, that you can propose to DoD and throw into that 804 acquisition process?
Yeah, I think I think at some level, yes. I think that the challenge that we have, particularly in capital programs like shipbuilding, is that, you know, your first production unit happens to be your prototype. And so, you know, you can get into some discussion about what sort of subunit prototyping do I need to do before I can go to production. But in fact, we have 200 years of history of doing lead ships. We kind of know that lead ships have there's a romance around lead ships that's all its own. And a lot of that has to do with its prototyping. Where, to Ron's point, is where we have gotten over the last a couple of decades in terms of language, is that we've decided now, I guess I came to Washington the first time about 25 years ago, and I was told back then that the Serengeti rule applies. If it limps, it dies. Okay, now I want you to think about that in terms of capital programs. And if the lens you're going to use on a capital program is it has to be on budget and it has to be on schedule, then you're going to force industry to go to a place where you better define all of your requirements 8 years early. Right. Okay? If you can move away from that discussion around, you know, the Serengeti rule, and you can move on to let's talk about how do we best meet the need of the warfighter as it sits today, and I don't know exactly how that language looks, but I have lived the dream of the language we have. I was up here as an example. I was up here about maybe within the last 10 years. I was on the Hill one morning at a breakfast, and the Pentagon issued a report that said, and I think it's an annual report that they put out, these are the 5 programs with the largest amount of cost growth in the last year. And it might have been some of the usual suspects that you had heard about and had been on the list before, but the Virginia-class submarine program was on that list. Now, at that point in time, the Virginia-class submarine program was the gold standard for shipbuilding. We were in serial production. Schedules were coming down. Learning curves were being exceeded. Costs were coming down. It was the model for how we want to set up all of our shipbuilding programs. How did the Virginia-class program get on that list? So my next meeting that morning was actually with Admiral Donald over at Naval Reactors, and he didn't even know that he hadn't seen the news yet. So when I told him that didn't make any sense to me. So he started making some phone calls, and it is amazing how quickly people call you back when you're the 4-star at Naval Reactors. He quickly got the answer back. Now, does anybody here know why the Virginia-class submarine program was on that list? That was the year we went to 2 submarines a year. And we went to 2 submarines a year because we had been so doggone efficient in the first one. Is there anybody in the room that had a positive thought when I said there was cost growth? I didn't think so. I didn't either, right? That's why language is so important to us, because you go to the Hill and you say we had something that had the largest amount of cost growth in the last 12 months. You say, oh my gosh, what's happened? Well, what's happened is that you had performance that that was good enough to allow us to say we need to go do more of this. So we got to get this language thing straightened out. And I absolutely, I like the way Ron's framed it. He's framed it in a really good way. I think that this is something that, frankly, I think that we all need to start talking to the Hill about. I think our taxpayers, they actually understand this language, but we're afraid to talk to them that way.
Yeah, good point. Thank you, Mr. Petters. So let's open it up to the audience. I'll start over here. Well, there's nobody over here. So I'll start with Mr. Larder.
Thank you. David Larder with Defense News. Mr. Petters, so in January, Secretary Spencer said that he'd made a promise to the president that the former Secretary Spencer, I should say, made a promise to the president that the Ford would be delivered on time, or would be delivered with advanced weapons elevators working this summer. He then had to backtrack, and when he did so, he said that he had gotten bad information from Huntington Ingalls, and they had, quote, no idea what was going on, and he had to go down there and take over the program. You know, I've heard a lot from the Navy, heard a lot from former Secretary Spencer. Be interested in your perspective on what happened there, and I think it bears on going forward. You know, did you fix anything institutionally so that the communication lines are a little better? Because you did say that there was, we can't be afraid to fail and what have you, but that was a program that was years in the making. That wasn't a last-minute requirements change. So if you could sort of explain what happened and what's changed going forward so that the program can kind of move forward.
Well, in short, what I would say is that whenever, as we talked about, anytime you do a lead ship, you're not moving in an incremental change in technology. You're actually making a 3 or 4 generation change in technology. In the specific case of weapons elevators, what we understood about weapons elevators at the end of last year was we have the structure pretty much in place. We know how to do that. We've got 19 technologies that, by and large, we've solved. We've got a few more to solve, maybe software, maybe wireless communications, things like that. And we actually had a path that said, let's go and we're gonna knock this out of the park. But then as we solved the last of those technology issues, we came to understand that the things that we understood about tolerances in fabrication needed to be adjusted. And what that did, when you go back and insert that into the schedule, that drives the schedule out. That is the romance of lead ships, that there is a try and fail, try until you get it right. There was a lot of communication back and forth with the Navy, who said what to who, all that stuff. In that environment, it's very complex. You know, as we worked our way through that, we ended up with the right team, with the right set of parameters. The ship, you know, we thought we would have a couple of elevators certified by the time the ship left the shipyard. We ended up with 4. We've had over 100 people on the ship since it went to sea, working around the crew, working with the crew, getting the rest of the elevators done. At this point, it's a production issue, and we believe that, and actually know that there's nothing in the weapons elevator system that's going to cause the ship to be late to deploy. So we've got a path. The Navy's partnered with us on this path. We're working very closely together, and I'm very confident about where that system's going to go going forward.
Next question. Go ahead and introduce yourself and then proceed with your question. Then we'll go to Sam.
Hi, Justin Katz, Inside Defense. Admiral, General, both of you briefly spoke about the damage and disruption and issues that a CR causes you. One of the few mechanisms of relief the military has under a CR, short of getting a new budget, are anomalies, a waivers list, permission to go ahead despite being under a CR. Secretary Gertz has acknowledged that there is a list being compiled and in the works. I was wondering if each of you could speak to the discussions you're having as far as anomalies are concerned. Are you being solicited for programs? Do you anticipate a waiver list is going to be sent? For example, Admiral, there's very aggressive schedule in the FY20 budget for the program like LUSV. Any comments you have on that? Thank you.
Sure. I guess I would say there is an opportunity. We are always kind of thinking about those lists and positioning ourselves for that outcome. Again, hopeful that we can get through this as quickly as possible because there's a lot of programs that are affected. You highlighted a couple of them that are featured in the Integrated Naval Force Structure Assessment, specifically the LUSV, but also the medium unmanned surface vehicle. But there's the frigate program and others. There's also R&D efforts that are critical for lethality. So we've made investments to try to shift to a sea control power projection Navy that are important. So choosing those wisely is something that we have to look at, but understanding the whole program is the message, and I think you've heard it consistently, and you articulated yourself of we got to get this on track so we can execute that program, the whole Navy program appropriately. So yes, we're considering those things, but I would say to me, when I look at that list I described on my desk, there's a lot of damage that can happen the longer the CR goes, and that's what concerns me. So, Eric?
Yeah, so I'll stick with my baseball analogy, but I'm not being flippant. I'm from Texas. This is how I speak. Anomalies do get granted at about the same rate that the Texas Rangers win the series, right? Which hasn't happened yet. They do get granted, but it's very infrequent. Congress holds that power, and they should hold that power. They have the power of the purse. I mean, I've read the Constitution, support it, defend it. That is their job. So I don't knock the fact that anomalies are very, very infrequent, because they in fact overturn the CR. So it is incredibly hard to get an anomaly done. The programs that we have, the scale which we have them, we're very, 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 very unlikely to get an anomaly through for the Marine Corps. But one of them, and I'll give you a very small example, the Marine Corps Warfighting Center, the War Gaming Center down at Quantico. It's a new start because I can't turn dirt until I get that lifted. We can provide to folks like Huntington Ingalls a much better set of requirements when I've wargamed it up to and including the SAP level if I have that Wargaming Center. Right? I mean, it's all inclusive up to and including, again, the SAP level. The sooner I get that, the more I can either use stochastic method or I can use deterministic method down there, and I can turn those quickly and provide a better outlook for industry. I can't even turn dirt under a CR. So I do not have great hope in an anomaly getting approved on the Marine Corps side.
Thank you. Thank you. Sam?
Hi, Sam Legrone with USNI News. So if the Navy and the Marine Corps are moving towards this more distributed mindset when it comes to platforms and how they're going to be organized in the future, I have some questions about battle networks and how those are going to be set up and that C2, given that the Navy and the Air Force have reached a handshake agreement between Admiral Gilda and General Goldfein. How is that going to work forward in that joint environment? The Navy's done a lot of work internally in investing in its own battle networks and integrating that. I see potentially a cultural issue dealing with the Air Force, given that a lot of the Navy battle networks are left over from some Wright-Patterson leave-behinds that the Air Force wasn't interested in developing. So how do you merge those together under a joint umbrella to where these battle networks will work jointly to get the distributed effects? It seems like a big hanging question out there that probably needs to be answered. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take the first bite at this apple. So Admiral Gilda talked about a new process at the OPNAV staff. It's called the Navy Corporate Forum. Topic 1 was Naval Tactical Grid and Joint All-Domain Command and Control. What are those topics? How are we dealing with them? Let's expose the DCNOs. Multiple DCNOs are engaged in this. N7, N2 and 6, and 9, and the Marine Corps. So at a practical level, Major General Frantini and Brigadier General Kumashiro are the guys I talk to from the Air Force on how do we map our pattern and behavior together to understand what the opportunity is and how we proceed forward. In the last 6 months, we've gone to the Shadow Ops Center at Nellis Air Force Base for one spin to do some experimentation where the Air Force sets up an environment where we can get at that. There's other plans in work. We want to get to the point where we can kind of lay those out and predict those experiments so we can align forces if necessary to do that, but we're not at that stage yet. So I would say a lot of opportunity here. The Naval Tactical Grid should plug into the Joint Tactical Grid. It shouldn't be a separate thing. Ideally, it has the same attributes and the same qualities across service. So that's the goal that we're all trying to achieve. I think we're organizing and assigning service-specific folks to go after that. But I named 3 DCNOs in specific that are aligned to that and come to that meeting with me when we meet with the Air Force to understand the opportunity and how to proceed forward. So that's a pretty brief answer, unsatisfying. I think we've got a ways to go here, but it's important work for us to do.
Yeah, and so by the way, I just signed that this morning on the way up. I was the last signatory for the structure of that executive steering committee for the Naval Tactical Grid. So literally, on the drive up this morning, me and 45,000 of my closest friends come from Quantico. I had time in a car, so I signed that. So we're in, myself and Lieutenant General Reynolds, who's our Deputy Commandant for Information, basically our M2 and M6. So there's a piece, JADC2, Joint All-Domain Command and Control, is a piece of that. Our Naval Tactical Grid has to fit into a joint grid. And first, we got to solve the JIFMIC piece to make sure that we are at a Naval Tactical Grid. There's no Marine Tactical Grid, right? When I, as the Commandant has said, everything we do is we have to come from and return to the sea. So it has to be that I'm ashore providing naval communications. So in a disaggregated environment, when communications are shut off, The analogy is if I'm below decks and Jim had to seal the hatch because the ship is going down, my damage control equipment is with me, and I'm going to fight the ship from below. He's going to fight it from above, and he's going to open the hatches when he can, once the leak is sealed. That's how we're working our network, so that when disaggregated and cut off, I can still fight, but I can fight in support of the fleets. That's the Naval Tactical Grid. So what you're talking about is the specifics of what we're doing is probably a different classification for them, but it is all in support of a Naval Tactical Grid that can push significant amounts of data, you know, whether it be clouds or cloudlets, right? Secure data, but also can survive when it is cut off from the outside world and immediately replug when I have the opportunity to reconnect, either because I've put the threat down or I've maneuvered. That's what we're doing. That also is JAD's Joint All-Domain Command and Control. And I meet, just like with Jim, I just had a meeting a couple days ago with Admiral Munch, who's the N7, and Eric Wesley, who's Army Futures Command Deputy. I talk to them all the time, and I also talk with the Air Force A5. You know, how do we support their low-cost detritables? So I talked to Admiral Fay, and you know, how do we assist you in doing that? So we are, in fact, talking about this jointly through the J7, Lieutenant General Dan O'Donohue. So we are doing a significant amount of work, I think, to plug this entire thing into and underneath General Nakasone, who actually has command and control. I mean, he owns the network. He actually has some authorities to say, thou shalt not. If you want to be on the network, you will do these things, and that's vital. Long answer, also unsatisfying, but truthful.
I would say, Sam, just to grab the mic back, though, it does require more than just the N6 to do this.
Yes.
Right? So I'm committed to support Admiral Kohler, and we define the Naval Tactical Grid to have the right SMEs from a weapons or a platform perspective to understand it, so it's not a finger pointing, I thought you did it or I thought you had it. Let's get together and map out that specific kill chain or kill chains and make sure we've got that issue covered, and or test it or experiment it. And if we don't, assign responsibility and go after it in the POM or a vehicle to make sure we have connectivity. So there is a level of coordination that is that I'm not used to that's happening.
Thank you. Ms. Eckstein.
Hi, Megan Eckstein with USNI News. I want to drill down on the fleet architecture issue a little bit. Admiral Gilda this morning spoke about sort of a shift away from a $2 billion 96 missile tube ship. General Berger previously has spoken about less exquisite amphibious or alternate ships to move Marines around. So I wonder, on the military side, how quickly are you willing and able to kind of commit to a new design and start engineering and buying these things? And then on the industry side, you know, if your yards are already optimized for more traditional destroyers or amphibs, how quickly can you kind of pivot to meet whatever the military decides they want to buy?
Hey, so Mike, can I start just to talk about, I think it has to be a partnership. So we've talked in some forums, Megan, I think you've been at it before, that we've talked about a requirements evaluation team, which is a different or a faster way to go at the JSITS process to develop a requirement where we kind of know the right answer and we have the right folks to get together and work through it. The frigate's an example, and I don't want to go into great detail of that because the RFP's out, but the generation of those requirements was done iteratively and done with industry to try to get to a better outcome. So I think that's an example of that communication, which allows industry to then get ahead of that and pivot and to anticipate what's coming. It's not a big reveal at the end. For the unmanned piece, I'd look at it like we have to be smart and not forget about the lessons Wayne E. Meyer taught us, right? So it also happens to be the 50th anniversary of the Aegis combat system in our Navy. And he produced a system which we've repeated over again, whether it was under Admiral Hicks at Aegis BMD or other organizations, where we had this stair-step approach to go prove out and test complexity and iteratively update our program so we could make it better. Similarly, I think we should think about that from an unmanned perspective. So we have a development squadron on the West Coast now under command of Captain Hank Adams. We need to look at these unmanned vehicles to provide us a different way to prolong our ability to fight. So if I take one unmanned vehicle and I view it as an adjunct magazine, say, and we sail into a conflict, and I start using that magazine instead of my own magazines, and then I send that magazine back, or that unmanned vehicle, to reload, and then I use my magazine, I prolong my ability to stay in the fight and maneuver. So that's a kind of an exemplar of how to do that differently. Notionally, that unmanned surface vehicle will be cheaper than a destroyer. So I think that's what Admiral Gilda is talking about it, but I think we have to be thoughtful and look at opportunity and not say, well, we figured out the right answer. It's an LUSV and an MUSV, pens down, we're done. I think we continually have to pressurize ourselves to say, how much does that cost? Is it affordable? Is it attritable? Is there a better way to do this? How does that fit into our war plan? And modify, modify, modify. So one other thing that comes that we've talked about is capability evolution plans and buying things in blocks. So if I can modify that block to make the next block better and more updatable, let's proceed down that path and kind of iterate our way through this and be more poised to position ourselves for success. I guess that'd be my answer, not an industry answer, but an operational answer. So.
Yeah. Well, I would just kind of follow up with that. I, again, not want to say too much. I do think the engagement with the industry on frigate was a good thing to do. I think that actually was refreshing, the way that worked. And I reserve the right to be a bit parochial here, but I would say that you know, our two shipyards, we're the largest employers in our states. So we have 35,000 people building ships today for the U.S. Navy, and we have 5,000 suppliers all across the country that are doing that. I would argue that that's an asset for the U.S. Navy that's absolutely as important as the carriers or the amphibs that we're building, is that workforce and the design talent and the supply chain that's out there. And we've talked a lot this morning, before this panel, we talked a lot about human capital. At our shipyard in Newport News, over half of the workforce has less than 3 years of experience. And so, and that is ahead of, I think, most of the rest of the industry, in that we're refreshing now the workforce in a way that we did this at Ingalls after Katrina about a decade ago. We're now doing it at Newport News, and as we look around, we're probably a little bit ahead of the rest of the industry to do that, but only because of the demographics. Really, we're not geniuses or anything. So when we start talking about left turns, we're not going to build that ship because we're going to build this ship. Well, my view is that I can actually have my workforce and my team ready to do that faster than you can make that decision, and I can absolutely do it faster than the appropriators can appropriate. So I'm just not too concerned about the ability of the industry to respond dynamically to whatever it is that we want to do. There is a mindset, though, that I'm going to go back to, is that we better be clear about how we measure success. And as I said, the taxpayers actually understand this, but we have gotten really timid about the Serengeti rule, and we just got to kill that. We actually have to have an honest discussion with the taxpayers about, hey, this is what this program's going to be. If we retire 100% of the risk, here's what it's going to be. But if we only retire 80% of the risk, it's going to be there. And we need to find a way to have that conversation. In the last couple of decades that I've been involved with it, if you start to have that conversation, then all of a sudden everybody gets scared and said, no, we don't want that little margin there of risk. And you end up with some really challenging environments. So as we go into this dynamic environment, I think we have to really think hard about the language.
Thank you.
Next question.
Hi, Mallory Shelbourne. I'm a reporter with Inside Defense. Admiral Kilby, you alluded to the force structure assessment and it being sort of a rolling document. Admiral Gilda said something similar this morning. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on what that would look like in practice and how you would ensure that a rolling document would be something that industry can keep up with, and also that expectations can be managed, and how that would play out.
Sure. I would characterize it as a process that doesn't stop, vice a rolling document. So if you look back historically, and again, I'm not an expert because I don't own the folks that do the force structure assessment, but it's been produced on kind of a 3-year basis. And that team goes and stands down and does other work. And then they stand up again to produce a force structure assessment when there's a driver to do so, or we need to relook at something. What I'm suggesting is this is so complex with the integration with the Marine Corps and the Navy that team doesn't stand down, that my team doesn't stand down, that Lieutenant General Smith's team doesn't stand down. And we look at the resultant from that and say, okay, what happens if we view this from a different perspective, from a different laydown, from a different mix of quantities, does that affirm our findings, or does that change our findings, and how do we work our way through that? So I think certainly we will have to produce a readout that shows folks where we are if things change. But I don't think they're going to change dramatically. I think we're going to do what Ron O'Rourke said when we produce the shipbuilding plan, as is mandated by Congress. We indicate what we see in that. And there's indicators about trends, where we think we're going to go. So now we've communicated, we've shown folks what we think is the value, in my case, of unmanned surface vehicles or the frigate. And it allows us to conceptualize and think of different force structures in the future and how we start to pivot to those. We're doing exercises internally. N96 recently went back and did iterations of, within their responsibility, for a capped limit of SCN, what different force structures you could buy and what the effect would be of those things. That's not the FSA, but they did some analysis, and it took them a year to put it together, and it's very robust. So we need to start thinking about things like that as opposed to individual platforms. And I need to think about it from the aggregate of the entire RDT&E portfolio, or the entire SCN portfolio, or the entire APN portfolio. A little easier for Admiral Harris because he kind of owns the APN portfolio. But the SCN portfolio is 96, it's 97, it's 98, and it's 95. So that's 4 resource sponsors that are competing within that one appropriation. So we just have to be a little more thoughtful, and I think this will provide us a vehicle to have that conversation and be more iterative, vice having a rolling document. I'd say it's a ongoing process that we can go back and challenge ourselves and our assumptions, and then go back and relook and be critical, again, be skeptical perhaps, to use the words of Secretary Miley, about what we're thinking.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more question. We got time for one more. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Denise Krepp. I'm a former Maritime Administration Chief Counsel. So I look at the world a little differently, and my world used to be logistics, talking about the commercial fleet, and quite frankly, your logistics, because it was the CIVMARs that were bringing everything with you. When I was Chief Counsel 10 years ago, the ships were crumbling. The men and women who were crewing those ships were aging. It hasn't improved in 10 years. So I would just ask, what are you working on with the Maritime Administration, with Admiral Busby, and with others to make sure that if and when we have a Korea-type situation, that we have the CIVMARs that are young enough to man the ships, we have the ships that are working, and we have the parts if those ships break down?
Okay, great question. In the N9 world, that doesn't fall directly under my umbrella, but Admiral Williamson is working this aggressively with Transcom and others, and Admiral Busley about CCAP recapitalization. I will say, though, the Integrated Naval Force Structure Assessment is going to produce a model of ships and different ship types. And the work we have to do in some of these iterations is go back and say, what's the logistics force to sustain that? What's the intra-theater lift and the inter-theater lift? So we tend to focus on the inter-theater lift from an EABO perspective. Need to do that absolutely from a connector's perspective. But we also need to look at the intra-theater lift and understand, once we produce a force structure that's distributed, does it generate a new demand signal on sea lift, or does it generate a new demand signal for the military sea lift command to go after? So that's all part and parcel of that. That won't be done in the first iteration. That's work for us to continue to iterate and work our way through. But it is on our mind. It is not lost for us that we need to do that. And Transcom won't let us lose it, for sure.
Thank you. Thank you for your terrific questions, and thank you all for participating and being here today. And thank you for the Naval Institute for putting on this forum. We really appreciate it. Join me, and thank you. You have something to say?
Well, I just want to say, let's give this panel was extremely timely and informative, and let's give them a big hand. And I'm going to give each panelist a copy of our book, but also just to close out here today, I'd like to thank our audience. I'd like to thank all our speakers who are here today, and also our sponsors with whom we can't make this all go. and that is USAA, Lockheed Martin, and Leonardo DRS. So again, this closes us out for this year's session, which I thought was very timely, very excellent. And let's give one more hand to all our speakers. Good afternoon.